This is 3 hours of straight Poppy Playtime lore. From dark theories to creepy details, this video breaks down almost everything this game has to offer. So feel free to let it play in the background whether you're sleeping, studying, or just chilling. Which toy suffered the absolute worst death in Poppy Playtime? From Mommy Longlegs to Doey the Doorman, we've seen some brutal ends, but one stands out as the most horrifying of them all. To figure out who endured the most painful demise, we need to examine the fate of each major toy, starting with the lesser enemies of Chapter 2. If you remember, Bunzo Bunny, the mini Huggy Wuggies, and PJ Pugapillar acted as Mommy Longlegs' minions in the game's second chapter. But here's what you might not have realized. After they failed to stop us, Mommy took her revenge, wiping them out one by one in a way that's disturbingly easy to overlook. Well, everyone except PJ. As we leave the minigames, eerie audio cues in the distance hint at their grim fates, suggesting something far worse than a simple game over. We also come across the corpses of Bunzo and the mini Huggies, trapped in cobwebs after their respective deaths. Surprisingly, their bodies remain mostly intact, which suggests that despite the disturbing noises Mommy made while killing them, their deaths weren't particularly gruesome. This just seems to be part of her nature. After all, we heard those same unhinged, demonic sounds even when she was simply chasing us down, so all things considered, the side characters in Chapter 2 didn't suffer the worst fates. Mommy Longlegs, on the other hand, was a completely different story. She was literally ground alive, feeling the blades tear through her body, slicing through her skin and organs as her abdomen was crushed. Her agonized screams made it painfully clear just how much she was suffering. However, she was at least granted the relief of death when her body finally split in two before the prototype dragged her remains away. Needless to say, Mommy endured a far worse fate than any other character in Chapter 2, and all at the hands of the player. As for our next character, Miss Delight, her fate was also sealed by the player. By pulling a lever, they slammed a gate down on her, instantly severing some of her limbs and leaving behind a spatter of blood. But there's a key difference between Mommy and Miss Delight's deaths. Miss Delight's was instantaneous. Based on her complete stillness and silence after being crushed, it's likely she only felt pain for a fraction of a second, if anything at all. This makes her death seem less extreme compared to someone like Dog Day, who arguably had one of the most tragic stories of any character in the game. After losing all of his friends, he had his legs torn off and was left hanging in a small cell, but the worst was yet to come. Right before our eyes, he was swarmed by a horde of mini smiling critters, infesting his body before he was ultimately used as a suit to hunt us down. This scene shook players to the core on a level no other moment in the game had, proving just how extreme his fate truly was. And with the blood-curdling screams of Dog Day echoing throughout, it's no surprise that his death is regarded as one of the most horrific in Poppy Playtime. Catnap's demise is another that deserves this grim title. While his actual death was instantaneous, losing consciousness immediately after being stabbed through the mouth by the prototype, the circumstances surrounding it made it even worse. Not only was he betrayed by the very being he worshipped as a god, realizing far too late that he had never truly been cared for, but we also played a direct role in his fate. By striking him with our electrified green grab pack hand, we caused him to burst into flames, ensuring his end in a way that was as brutal as it was heartbreaking. The cries of pain made it clear that Catnap's final moments before his true demise were filled with physical discomfort. Given all this, it's undeniable that Catnap's demise was nothing short of tragic, similar to the death of the beloved Pianosaurus, everyone's favorite dinosaur. His time to shine was tragically cut short when Doey the Doorman used his raw strength to toss him around the room like, well, a toy. A trail of blood was left in his wake, and by the time Doey was finished, Pianosaurus had been decapitated. There's no denying that his death was brutal, not only in the literal way, but also in the sense that it resulted in more screen time for him in promotional material than in the actual game. A character who had significantly more screen time is Yarnaby, whose death was surprisingly similar to the first half of Catnap's. After attempting to hunt us down, the lion suddenly caught fire due to a burning pit below him. He fell right into it, still engulfed in flames. It's safe to assume that being burned alive while trapped on a hook, desperately trying to break free, was a traumatic experience for Yarnaby. His plummet into the pit where the heat originated would have been even more terrifying. However, in comparison to some of the other toys' deaths, Yarnaby's demise doesn't seem as bad, so the severity of his final moments really depends on how you look at it. Next, we move on to Yarnaby's master, the Doctor. Before the events of the game, he had been transformed into a cyborg, his organs scattered across various stasis chambers. A whole section of Chapter 4 was devoted to destroying these organic components, and the Doctor clearly felt every bit of it, which must have been painful, but that was nothing compared to the agony he experienced when we took his Omni chip, causing his brain computer to explode while he screamed in torment. The fact that we hear him yell out makes it clear that this was the most excruciating part of his final moments. What's interesting though is that the Omni chip doesn't immediately shut him down.
You saved no one.
This suggests that the Doctor can indeed function without the Omni chip, at least for some time. It could even hint at his possible return in Chapter 5, however, what stands out here is the weakness in his voice. After enduring such excruciating pain, he had lost all his strength. Despite everything, however, the Doctor's death wasn't particularly violent compared to many others, unlike the final character, Doey the Doorman. The events leading up to his death only make the moment even more tragic. We learn through a VHS tape that he murdered his own parents, though not by his own will. One of his 3 test subjects, an orphan with severe anger issues, had temporarily taken over Doey's consciousness at the time. Not long after discovering this revelation, the safe haven is destroyed, taking his friends and everything Doey had worked for the past decade. This is when he completely loses his mind, chasing us down before we seemingly defeat him in a boss battle. But as it turns out, that wasn't the end of him at all.
You and Poppy! It's all your fault!
This is where Doey finally meets his end. The player shoots a liquid nitrogen canister to disorient him, and with no other options, we're forced to drop a massive crusher onto the poor Doorman as he groans in discomfort. Using all his strength, he manages to hold the crusher up, preventing it from landing down on him, but this doesn't last long. His mind becomes overwhelmed with thoughts and emotions, and unable to focus, he finally lets go of the crusher. What follows is a slow, excruciating death right before our eyes that concludes with Doey apologizing for what he has done. Yet, the player simply moves on, leaving Doey's body to rot, presumably until the prototype comes along to take it away. So, as for who suffered the most awful death, I personally believe it was Dog Day. He was forced to just hang there being eaten from the inside. It's an incredibly dark and grim way to go out. But of course, there are many contenders for whose end was truly the most horrific. Kissy Missy is our key to everything in Poppy Playtime, and no, that's not an exaggeration. So far, she's been one of our few true allies, standing alongside Poppy and Doey in Chapter 4. At first glance, it might seem like her role exists purely to add some wholesomeness to an otherwise dark and eerie game, but in reality, her presence in this story runs far deeper than that. Kissy Missy holds the answers. Answers that could change everything we thought we knew about the bigger bodies, the factory, and even the prototype himself, and she just may be the most crucial piece of the puzzle yet. So what exactly makes her so important? Well, let's start with what we already know. It took a while, but Chapter 4 finally gave us an actual document about Kissy Missy's bigger body form, Experiment 1172. And interestingly, this places her just a couple of experiments after Huggy Wuggy. Now, how do we know for sure that this document is referring to Kissy Missy? Well, the note explicitly states that she was relocated to Storage B, which is exactly where she was seen in the restricted relocation video uploaded to Mob Entertainment's YouTube. According to the same document, Kissy struggled with mental health issues, often experiencing stress and anxiety. This type of behavior is also displayed in-game.
Soon as we reach the bottom, we'll send the lift back up. Just hold tight, okay?
Another key aspect of Kissy Missy's personality is her tendency to mindlessly follow Poppy around. At first, the game seemed to intentionally portray her as defenseless, almost as if she was unable to think for herself, but Chapter 4 completely shattered that assumption. Even after Poppy ran away and Ollie was revealed to be the prototype, leaving Kissy terrified, she still chose to help us, grabbing onto us right as the ground collapsed. Clearly, Kissy Missy is mentally stronger than we ever gave her credit for, and not only that, she possesses physical strength as well. Just think back to when she effortlessly grabbed and pulled us into a wall crevice, or even the Hour of Joy where she brutally knocked around Playtime co-employees. Now, speaking of the Hour of Joy, there's always been something odd about Kissy Missy's role in the massacre. She actively participated in the prototype's plan, yet now she's apparently on full board with Poppy's mission to kill him? As we've already established, Kissy is far from weak. She's perfectly capable of fending for herself, so her attachment to Poppy, a tiny plastic doll, likely isn't due to dependence. Instead, the most logical explanation? Kissy Missy simply desires a friend, companionship, which could explain why she's been so crucial to everything happening in the factory. Whether she realizes it or not, her choices are actively shaping the future of Playtime Co. In fact, the previously mentioned document about Kissy explicitly states that she began to feel better after being allowed to socialize with other toys, and we already saw how happy she was alongside Huggy Wuggy in the official Sleep Well music video. However, I don't believe that Kissy Missy actually wants the prototype dead. Instead, I think she's just pretending to be in agreement with Poppy's plan in order to stay on her good side. Consider this. When Kissy pulled the lever to help us in Chapter 2, she likely didn't know that we were siding with Poppy or that we were against the prototype at that time. Then, in Chapter 3, she presumably only attacked us because emotions were running high at Playcare. Well, that's what Poppy says.
No! Let go! They didn't do anything wrong. We're actually here to help. This place makes her tense.
Although there is another possible explanation for this, which we'll get into soon. As for why Kissy chose to save us at the end of Chapter 4 even though she could have betrayed us, it was probably because she still cares about us, just as she does for Poppy, even if she doesn't fully agree with her plan. Let's not forget that Kissy Missy hasn't actually done anything physically to help the mission, at least not willingly. Meanwhile, we have planted the explosives in the factory's foundation and just literally gone along with every one of Poppy's commands. Ultimately, Kissy Missy is in the middle ground between Poppy and the prototype, and that's exactly why she's so important. Whether she stays neutral or finally takes a side, Kissy might be the deciding factor on how this entire story unfolds. So, that leaves us with two major questions. Why would she side with the prototype, and how does this all tie into her hidden importance? To start with, even though Kissy is far stronger than we initially thought, her gentle nature still makes her easy to manipulate. And as we know, the prototype is always looking for ways to exploit the vulnerable. Who could forget Catnap, right? Additionally, we can use clues from the spin-off game Project Playtime to discover even more answers.
They are trying to build more toys, more like you. It has to be stopped.
Huggy Wuggy was being telepathically communicated with, most likely by the prototype. Given how closely the experiment forms of Huggy and Kissy Missy were created, it wouldn't be surprising if the prototype could also speak directly into Kissy's mind in the same way. In fact, this could be the real reason behind certain moments in the game, such as when Kissy attacked us in Chapter 3 only to be stopped by Poppy. It's possible that Kissy Missy is constantly torn between following the prototype's telepathic commands or listening to the people physically near her. However, if this theory is true, you'd expect Kissy to act aggressively a lot more often, so why doesn't she? Well, there's a strong possibility that the prototype's ability to communicate telepathically has begun to weaken over time. Since the events of Project Playtime, he may even be struggling to maintain direct control over the toys' minds. And let's not forget, Doey managed to scare off the prototype twice in Chapter 4. At this point, it genuinely seems like the prototype is getting weaker by the day, which actually makes perfect sense. We know he's mostly organic, as confirmed by a trailer stating that he contains a digestive tract, not to mention his claws filled with bones, only reinforcing this. And just like any other biological creature, the prototype would naturally decline over time, especially given that he is also partially mechanical. So there's a good chance that his entire mission, his true goal, has always been about stopping his own inevitable decline.
Your suggestions?
To produce the results I'm after. Have I made an error in allowing your survival?
And if the prototype really is getting weaker, that only raises an even bigger question. Why would he specifically go after Kissy Missy? Clearly, there's something about her that makes her more important to this story than we ever realized. If you recall Chapter 3's ending, Kissy Missy was attacked by something. She managed to survive, but not without burn marks and bandages as proof of the encounter. Now, the obvious assumption is that the prototype was responsible, betraying yet another one of the many toys he's taken advantage of. But there's something oddly specific about who was attacked. Of all the toys inside Playtime Co., why would the ambusher go after Kissy Missy, one of the most unthreatening experiments of them all? This is why I believe there's more to this than meets the eye. Obviously, the prototype may have attempted to kill Kissy simply because she's technically following Poppy, even though she doesn't fully support the plan, but I believe the actual motive is because Kissy has been unknowingly helping us execute Poppy's plan all along, playing a crucial yet indirect role in making sure everything goes smoothly. Just think about it. Kissy Missy was the only reason we didn't hit a dead end when we reached the closed gate in Chapter 2. If she hadn't been there, the player would have been trapped indefinitely, likely starving to death in that area after so long. She also pulled the lever to lower the elevator that Poppy and the player were standing on, allowing us to continue the journey. Yeah, Kissy definitely has a habit of conveniently pulling levers, and what's even weirder, the second time she did it was right before she got ambushed. Almost like the prototype finally decided, alright, that's enough. So here's what I think moving forward. Kissy Missy is going to actively help bring Poppy's plan to completion, especially after the prototype betrayed her. She might even assist us directly, helping solve puzzles, uncovering more lore, and piecing together the dark history of Playtime Co., finally giving us the answers we've been searching for. What if I told you that the real Ollie never actually died and might still be somewhere in the factory? Now, I know that sounds crazy, but if we take a closer look at the evidence I found, there's actually a very strong case for it. Not only does it suggest that Ollie survived, but it also hints that he could play a major role in Chapter 5. Let's start by addressing the obvious. The prototype spent an extensive amount of time mimicking Ollie's voice, which initially led many to believe that Ollie was nothing more than a non-existent child created by the prototype as a way to deceive us and Poppy. However, this assumption didn't turn out to be correct. Ollie was, in fact, a real person, most likely a child, and based on everything we know so far, it seems as though he's long gone.
Was there ever an Ollie?
Yes, there was.
But that was a very long time ago.
It's also important to recognize a crucial pattern. The prototype tends to only mimic the voices of Playtime Co. employees, all of whom were killed during the Hour of Joy. This strongly suggests that anyone whose voice the prototype copies is already dead. So, if that's the case, why would Ollie be the one exception? To answer this, we need to break down all the hints we've been given. By carefully piecing them together, we can form a solid conclusion about Ollie's fate. Then we can examine why his potential survival even matters to the story. For a rather simple theory, if you go out of bounds in Chapter 3, you can actually discover an unreachable area labeled in developer text as Ollie's room. This strongly indicates that Ollie was an orphan living in play care before the factory shut down. And here's where things get really interesting. A VHS tape from Chapter 3 heavily implied that the orphans were not among the victims of the toy massacre. Later in Chapter 4, this was fully confirmed when Poppy informed us that the children are below in the labs. If this theory holds true, it would mean that Ollie is still alive, living alongside the other surviving orphans. But if that's the case, why would the prototype, out of all possible voices, specifically choose to mimic his? Well, it seems that the prototype can only mimic the voices of those he's spent significant time with, and this wouldn't be the first instance of him forming a close bond with a particular child. After all, he once secretly collaborated with an orphan named Theodore Graham Bell, working alongside him to escape the facility, communicating with him in secrecy while everyone else remained completely unaware. So perhaps Ollie and the prototype had also spent a great deal of time together at some point, making Ollie's voice the most convenient one to imitate. But what if the truth behind Ollie's fate isn't as simple as that? If you recall, during Chapter 3's first nightmare sequence, multiple radios were scattered across the never-ending hallways of Home Sweet Home, each revealing details about a deeply disturbing discovery at Elliot Ludwig's estate.
Local authorities report that the body of a young boy has been found on the estate of the late Elliot Ludwig, an esteemed toy maker and originator of the Playtime company.
In the actual game, these gruesome details were primarily used to enhance the nightmare sequence's atmosphere, but the lore itself seems significant, and here's where things take a dark turn. I believe the deceased child mentioned in those radios was Ollie himself. At first, this may sound like a far-fetched theory, but there's actually a substantial amount of evidence supporting this idea. More importantly, it could explain how Ollie is still present in Playtime Co. during the events of the game. For starters, we need to look into the possibility that Elliot Ludwig and the prototype are one and the same. Now, I know that Chapter 4 might seem to contradict this idea.
I wish you were here, Dad. When you were running this place, you always knew what to say. I miss you.
This confirms that Poppy is Ludwig's daughter, but it's stated in the same tape that she hates the prototype. This should seemingly prove that Ludwig and the prototype are not the same entity, unless Poppy simply doesn't realize that they are. Now, some might argue that Poppy knew her father well enough to recognize that a kind and caring man like him couldn't possibly be the same person inhabiting the murderous prototype. However, we don't actually have concrete proof that Ludwig was as good-hearted as she might believe. In fact, there's some strongly unsettling evidence to suggest otherwise. The orientation notebook heavily implies that every Poppy doll sold back in 1950 was made using human parts, and Ludwig was very much alive at that time. It's hard to believe that he wasn't involved in such horrific practices, not to mention how suspicious it is that he had Playcare built deep underground, hidden from plain sight. It raises the question, was Ludwig really the all-loving man that some believe him to be? Now, just because Ludwig might have been an evil figure, that doesn't necessarily mean he was incapable of being a decent father to Poppy. Consider the VHS tape from Chapter 4, the one where Ollie is heard comforting Poppy while she suffers from a traumatic episode. At this point, we still don't know whether the Ollie in that tape was the real one or simply the prototype imitating him, but if it was the prototype, and Ludwig is truly his identity, then this moment could prove that despite everything, he still genuinely cares about his daughter.
I'm here, Poppy. For you, I'll always be here.
This still leaves two major questions unanswered, though. If Ludwig, as the prototype, truly cares for Poppy, then why would he want to lock her inside a case? And if Ollie was the corpse found at Ludwig's home, wouldn't that mean he's officially dead? For the first mystery, there's a strong possibility that Ludwig was simply trying to protect his daughter. Yes, his speech at the end of Chapter 4 certainly gives off the vibe of a typical villainous monologue. However, there are moments where he doesn't seem purely evil, where his words feel more personal than anything, almost as if he's trying to justify his actions specifically to Poppy rather than to anyone else.
It's always been about you and
Poppy, what we are.
This suggests that beneath all of his terrifying actions, there may still be a lingering sense of fatherly care, a belief that keeping Poppy contained was in some twisted way for her own good. Not to mention that according to the orientation notebook, Poppy lived in her case while Ludwig was still a human, and it's literally Poppy's case that the prototype refers to as her home. Now, as for the possibility that Ollie isn't actually dead, let's take another look at the deceased child found at Ludwig's estate. A likely possibility is that the doctor, Harley Sawyer, was the one who planted this corpse in order to frame Ludwig. We already know that Ludwig and Sawyer had serious bad blood between them, stemming from the fact that Ludwig personally removed Sawyer from the Young Geniuses program. This could have been Sawyer's way of getting revenge by setting Ludwig up to take the fall for something he didn't actually do. Even if we assume Ludwig was a bad guy, which is the perspective we're following for this theory, it still doesn't really add up for him to have murdered a child. By the time Ludwig presumably became the prototype, he was already against the experimentation happening within Playtime Co., which is exactly why he orchestrated the Hour of Joy in the first place. Sure, he may have been involved in using human organs for the Poppy dolls back in the day, but at some point, his perspective shifted. This possible change of heart can actually be traced back to the letter Ludwig wrote when removing Sawyer from the program. In it, he mentioned that he had changed after truly seeing the world again. Of course, this doesn't explain why he had the playcare built so deep underground, but that's a mystery for another time. Of course, Sawyer's main priority in life was science above all else. The corpse, who we had previously theorized could have been Ollie, was reported to be missing important components.
Organs, as well as key bones for the skeletal structure, were reported missing from the body. It is unknown at this time whether this extraction was, in fact, the cause of death.
These are the exact parts used to create the bigger body toys. This means Sawyer may have used Ollie not only as a means to frame Ludwig, but also as a test subject for some of his own twisted experiments at Playtime Co. And here's the most interesting part. If Ludwig truly is the prototype, he may not even be aware of what really happened to Ollie. This could explain why he simply assumes that Ollie is dead without considering any alternative possibilities. So, what was the point of unraveling all of this? Well, if this theory holds up, it's very possible that we'll actually encounter Ollie as a bigger body experiment in Chapter 5. He might even give us a rundown of his backstory, revealing the truth about what really happened, and from there, join us in the fight against the prototype. It makes sense as well. I mean, who would be okay with their voice being stolen and used without their permission? That alone could serve as his personal motivation to help us. If this is true, Ollie might become a third ally alongside Poppy and Kissy Missy, if they return, that is. Huggy Wuggy is back and he's mad. Or is he? Chapter 4 of Poppy Playtime ended on the ultimate cliffhanger. The series mascot himself seemingly returned from the dead, but why? Prior to this, we'd been under the assumption that he was dead. He fell from an extraordinary height, and Poppy later confirmed his death herself. So how and why is he here? Well, I've actually solved exactly what you're looking for. As the simplest answer is usually the correct one, the idea that he has returned to finish what he started back in Chapter 1 would be the most logical reason. Depending on how much time has passed in the game, this could be anywhere from a few hours ago to almost a full day. Regardless, it wouldn't be surprising if he held a deep grudge against us. Going beyond this, however, there seems to be a link between us, the player, and Huggy. One of the most enduring mysteries of the series is who we play as. Some people believe we're Stella Graber, Rich Lovitz, or PW, a character introduced through the Orientation Handbook, which was released shortly after Chapter 3. This has led to a solid theory that we are playing as him due to the player sharing the same birthday.
I know when your birthday is! June 28th.
Working in familiar areas such as Playcare and the game station.
But you worked here.
And a reason for us to feel haunted by our guilt. PW was a biologist in the factory. He directly participated in the experiments. That means that if we're playing as PW, we could know Huggy due to him being one of our experiments, perhaps our first. Huggy's face haunts us long after Chapter 1 finishes. Our Home Sweet Home hallucinations feature a nightmare Huggy and ends with one during Poppy's monologue. There is potential history between us, which makes the idea of Huggy wanting to kill us even more logical. There's also a chance that Huggy remembers his previous life. Back when Huggy escaped from Playtime back in 1992, he was finally found standing outside a house. While it was noted that his intentions were unclear, we see this kind of behavior in a bigger body who's very similar to Huggy, his wife, Kissy Missy. In Chapter 3, we see Kissy sitting on a bed, ignoring our presence and sadly gazing at a picture. As Huggy and Kissy were made to complement one another, it would make sense that their experiments undertook similar methods, subsequently resulting in a similar outcome. If Huggy really does remember his past, that's going to have a huge impact on his behavior. And contrary to what we're made to believe, Huggy does appear to have his own mind as proven by a Chapter 2 tape.
Experiment 1170, Huggy Wuggy, remains the optimal outcome due to his sufficient intelligence paired with maximum obedience. End of log.
Huggy possesses intelligence which differs vastly from a previous bigger body, Experiment 1166, aka Yarnaby, who appears to only have strength. He operates in the way Yarnaby should by being a loyal and caring friend to his owner, but the cognitive functions of Quinn Navidson, who was turned into Yarnaby, appear to be gone. Huggy, and by extension Kissy, are improvements from this failure, and so they can retain their previous human tendencies, which grants them agency. Even though Huggy is described as having maximum obedience, we've already shown that this was not foolproof as he turned on the Playtime staff various times. Huggy escaped from the factory for hours and, most shockingly, participated in the Hour of Joy, brutally murdering people without hesitation. This proves that Huggy was also able to obey the prototype. All of this shows us that Huggy is not only intelligent, but also has emotions and acts on them. That's why I believe the real reason Huggy has returned for Chapter 5 is to save us. Yes, that's going against common sense, but there's a reason for it. If you look at the room we are trapped in at the end of Chapter 4, there's no way out. That would mean that Chapter 5 would be very short, as would the entire story. Unless Kissy jumped down into the hole to rescue us, we're on our own. For this reason alone, it doesn't make perfect sense for Huggy to be there simply to kill us, but then, why the sudden change of heart? As we've already said, there hasn't been a significant amount of time between Chapter 1 and Chapter 4 in game hours, so why would Huggy have such a shift? We think this, once again, goes back to Huggy's intelligence and agency. Although we have no evidence on how Huggy feels towards the prototype, we do know that the prototype has his fair share of enemies.
We tried to fight it. The prototype's control. I am the last of the smiling critters.
The toys in Safe Haven seem to be genuinely concerned for Kissy, but couldn't feel any more different towards Poppy and the prototype. This shows that Kissy almost certainly is not on his side. While we also don't know who attacked Kissy, with this evidence, it makes more sense for the prototype to be her attacker, not Huggy as has been theorized. If Huggy were her attacker, there's a good chance that Kissy would have told Poppy, who then would have told us. Obviously, this did not happen. If the prototype was who ambushed Kissy, this could be the ultimate trigger for Huggy's switch of sides. If you manage to get a look at the vent in which Huggy chases us through in Chapter 1, you'll see various words and phrases. Many of them are no and stop, similar to what is said at Poppy's flower symbol on the wall, but there are also full phrases and words such as starving and this isn't my body. We don't know who exactly the author of these words is, but this lines up with it potentially being written by Huggy himself. He's starving and possibly aware that he's in the wrong body, but what's most important are the phrases, let her die, don't let her out, she's on their side, she wouldn't kill, the prototype has saved us. Whoever wrote these words hates Poppy. While this is a similar sentiment shared throughout the factory, the last line differs from what the toys in Safe Haven, for example, feel. The toys in Safe Haven despise Poppy as she left them and never returned.
You disappeared. You left us. We looked and we looked, and there was just nothing. No sign of you.
But they feel even more hatred for the prototype himself. The words in the vent, however, are mad at Poppy because she wouldn't participate in the Hour of Joy, and they're on the prototype's side. So, with all this evidence, I propose the following theory. Huggy sided with the prototype and took part in the Hour of Joy. Other toys did the same to an extent, as they all wanted the same thing, freedom. This changed, however, when the prototype refused to let the toys leave and food became low. Some, such as Kissy and Poppy, turned away from the prototype, whereas others, such as Catnap and Huggy, stayed as they were still free from the employees, and that was the main goal. If Huggy and Kissy were on opposite sides, then it would have forced them to split. That doesn't mean they would have hated each other, though. In the music video Sleep Well, we see Huggy and Kissy laying together, giving the impression that they have genuine feelings for one another. After all, it's what they're programmed to feel, and the toys can often still operate in ways their assigned toys are supposed to, regardless of their previous personality traits. This means that Huggy's state of mind is possibly more fragile than most. He's starving, he doesn't have any companionship, and the player does something which could have triggered him severely. Similar to Catnap, Huggy doesn't attack us until a specific moment. This moment was after we started the Make-A-Friend machine and created a toy. This could have sparked some trauma within Huggy, and that's why he went for us. It possibly had nothing to do with orders from the prototype, but him acting off his own emotions. He then pulls himself up in Chapter 2, leaving tufts of hair and blood in his wake. He somehow patches himself back together, continues to stalk us silently around the factory, and sees the prototype kill Catnap, almost kill Kissy, and blow up Safe Haven. It's at this point that Huggy realizes that the prototype is never going to be the savior of the toys. It's just a matter of time before he's next. That's why he has no choice but to switch sides and be our ally. For now, at least. Huggy being on our side will still be a cautious one, as he could flip at any moment, but right now we're his only option, and he's really our last hope too. It's the reason he had to return. Doey the Doorman actually devoured Pianosaurus, but how can a living ball of dough with no organs eat anything, let alone a massive dino-like creature? Well, what I found out might change everything we thought we knew about Doey and every other bigger body experiment. It could even hint at what's coming in Chapter 5, but first, there's one crucial fact we need to clear up. These toys do, in fact, need food to survive.
And they ate the bodies to stay alive.
Now, there are some exceptions to this rule, most notably Poppy and the prototype, the latter being directly confirmed to not require sustenance through some hidden text in the Chapter 1 trailer, and we can conclude that Poppy is the same given she survived locked in her case for an entire decade. However, these experiments technically aren't products of the Bigger Body Initiative. Poppy was created by Elliot Ludwig many years before the initiative even started, and the prototype is known to have existed by 1989, while the initiative was introduced in 1990. Simply put, their ability to survive without sustenance likely comes down to how they were created. Doey, on the other hand, is without a doubt an official Bigger Body experiment, and since the previously mentioned trailer near enough confirms that a digestive tract is the reason nourishment is crucial to these toys' survival, it's safe to assume that Doey must have been one as well. So, if that's the case, why does Doey's body appear to have no organs at all, including no digestive tract? Well, considering that Doey can shift his body at will, a feature that was intentionally designed into his bigger body form, it's likely that his biological components, including his blood, are physically fused into the dough that makes up his entire form. It might sound far-fetched, but logically, this is the only conclusion that explains certain moments throughout Chapter 4. For example, when Doey supposedly met his demise after the third chainsaw strike, he appears to dissolve into the ground, no gore being shown, only to fully reassemble minutes later as if nothing happened at all. That being said, Doey does still seem to have an esophagus, not only because this body part is technically just an empty tunnel, but also because of a particular moment after his first introduction where he creepily walks forward while keeping his head perfectly still, with only his neck keeping his head and body connected. Besides, the food obviously has to go somewhere, so when Doey swallows something, it likely travels down his esophagus and ends up in another pile of dough where his hidden digestive organs are stored within. But that still leaves one big mystery. How was Doey able to consume an enormous bigger body like Pianosaurus?
Now that hit the spot. I haven't eaten in weeks.
As we saw, Pianosaurus's head was completely decapitated, suggesting that Doey gruesomely tore him apart before feasting on smaller sections at a time. However, there's something strange about this. Pianosaurus was made of hard metal, so how did a literal Play-Doh toy manage to overpower him? Well, believe it or not, Doey actually had teeth. They can be hard to spot in game, but during the right scenes and under the correct lighting, they're clearly visible. So it's possible Doey crunched down on Pianosaurus's metal parts with tremendous force, otherwise he probably would have choked to death. Unless Doey might have an entirely different method of food consumption. Since his entire body is made of organic dough, it's possible that he absorbs his food simply by pressing it against himself, allowing his flesh-like dough to break it down and process the nutrients. And it's worth noting that Doey ate Pianosaurus extremely quickly and no chewing sounds were ever heard. This makes it even more likely that he simply used sheer strength to tear Pianosaurus into smaller chunks, then absorbed him in the way we just described. If this is true, then it would mean that Doey's entire body is a functioning digestive system, a design that would make perfect sense for an experiment that needs sustenance to survive. But if that's the case, then we have one big question. Why was Doey given teeth if he didn't even need made them. We know that Playtime Co. scientists designed each bigger body with their job role in mind. Huggy Wuggy, the security guard, was made with immense strength according to the orientation notebook, allowing him to overpower threats. Catnap was built with a gas delivery apparatus so he could put the Playcare orphans to sleep every night. So with this in mind, Doey's teeth must have served a purpose, and when we piece everything together, there's only one logical conclusion.
If we're to create an experiment that can fulfill multiple assigned roles, we can't allow any single consciousness to throw the others off.
Doey was designed to work multiple jobs within the factory. One of these roles may have been an extra security measure for one of Playtime's many underground facilities in case someone without clearance was to ever find themselves there. If so, Doey's role for this particular job of his would be to make sure no intruders ever came in and went back out alive. This would also explain how he was powerful enough to fend off the prototype twice in Chapter 4, despite him being the most dangerous experiment. Now, even if Doey could absorb food by simply touching it, there's no way this method would work on an entire person, so this may be why he was given teeth, to attack and consume any trespassers who posed a threat. Now, when we compare all of this to how other toys eat, it really makes Doey stand out. Huggy Wuggy was shown to have actual intestines in the Doctor's cinematic trailer, so it's pretty clear how he consumes his prey. A document from the Chapter 3 ARG explicitly confirms that real organic components were used in the creation of Catnap. Mommy Longlegs seems to have a similar organic system to humans, given the massive amounts of blood spilled after her gruesome demise in the grinder. And then there's Boxy Boo, whose digestive system remains a mystery, though it's likely that anything he eats is simply digested inside his mouth, since there's no way he can swallow anything through some twisty springs. So why is Doey so unique? Surprisingly, it probably has nothing to do with the fact that he was made from 3 different test subjects rather than the usual one. Instead, it likely ties into the timing of his creation. Doey is Experiment 1322. Most previous experiments we've encountered were numbered in the 1100s and created during the 1990s. The only exception being Mommy Longlegs' Experiment 1222, who was created in 1991. Even so, she was still a whole 100 experiments before Doey, who wasn't even created until 2 years after this. By this point, the scientists had probably significantly improved their bigger body procedures, learning how to make them even more advanced and efficient. This explains why Doey can shapeshift, travel through walls, and even use 2 different methods for food intake. Simply put, he's far more advanced than those that came before him. What does this mean for Chapter 5 and the future of Poppy Playtime? If you recall, our next location is the very place where these monstrous bigger bodies were created.
Well, rest assured, friend, our state-of-the-art laboratory is just up ahead.
Of course, it's glaringly obvious that we're going to encounter many new experiments here, most likely the later creations made by Playtime Co. before the factory shut down. Since these toys have more advanced biology, they would have been stronger and been able to survive much longer in the cruel, decaying depths of what was once a magical toy factory. I mean, think about it. How do you think Doey managed to successfully protect his toy friends for all those years? And how did he keep himself alive and well until the prototype came along and destroyed Safe Haven? Now, a very likely scenario is that aside from the prototype, the main toy antagonist of Chapter 5 will be Experiment 1424, a character first detailed in one of Chapter 4's many documents. There may not be a ton of evidence for this at the moment, but it certainly wouldn't be the first time an upcoming character was foreshadowed in an earlier chapter.
Subject is stable. Designated 1322.
What if I told you Boxy Boo is not gone for good? Chapter 5 is set to introduce new antagonists alongside the prototype, but what if one of them is a familiar face? There's actually a lot of evidence pointing to Boxy Boo's return, and if it's true, it changes everything we thought we knew about Playtime Co.'s experiments, because the truth about Boxy runs much deeper than we've been led to believe. So let's break it all down, starting with what sets him apart from every other experiment. Boxy Boo isn't just another toy. He's a predator in every sense of the word. We watched him devour people during the Hour of Joy, and that wasn't just mindless violence. As the very first creation of the Bigger Bodies Initiative, Boxy wasn't just made to be dangerous. He was built for something far worse.
Now, we need to start taming that appetite of yours to flesh.
His primary role was to eliminate any unauthorized personnel who learnt about the initiative by literally eating them alive. This explains why he was engineered with razor-sharp teeth and a mouth capable of unhinging wide open. In the spin-off game Project Playtime, we also see that Boxy Boo has several deadly abilities beyond just biting. He can pull people in using his powerful claws, hide inside his jack-in-the-box to ambush prey unexpectedly, and leap absurd distances to chase down his victims. These predatory instincts are even reinforced in Boxy Boo's official character description. Now, Rowan Stoll was infamously Boxy's first known victim, but based on the orientation notebook, it's strongly implied that he was far from the only one. According to Mob Entertainment's 12 Days of Playtime marketing campaign, Boxy's hunger is never truly satisfied, meaning he is constantly searching for more food. With these instincts and abilities, it makes perfect sense how Boxy could have survived for so long after the Hour of Joy. Well, it makes sense upon a first glance at least. Like other large-scale experiments, he likely preyed upon smaller toys to sustain himself, and if any other creatures attempted to consume him, his natural hunting skills would allow for self-defense, likely overpowering most threats. However, this obviously wouldn't work in every case. Certain experiments, like catnap, could have the upper hand on Boxy, specifically due to his ability to breathe out red smoke, which instantly puts anyone who inhales it to sleep. We know that the toys are not immune to the smoke's effects because, for starters, in Yarnaby's cinematic trailer, we saw the red gas being dispensed into the prison cells where the toys were kept, implying that just like the orphans, they were also anesthetized every night. Plus, during the 12 Days of Playtime event, catnap was specifically described as being naturally immune to the smoke. This detail surely wouldn't be mentioned if all the toys shared that same immunity, so while Boxy Boo may have been one of the most dominant predators in the factory, it's unlikely that he was completely invincible. This raises a big question. How and why has Boxy Boo managed to survive for so long since the Hour of Joy? A few possibilities come to mind. He could have spent most of his time hiding away in his jack-in-the-box, camouflaging himself within the environment to avoid detection, or he might be hiding in the labs, an area that most other toys wouldn't be able to access due to its advanced security measures.
This is the single most high-security, high-clearance section of the whole factory. When someone finds you down here, you will be shot. And before you get any ideas, don't think you can just sneak away either.
And if any toy could sneak its way into such a heavily secured area, of course it would be the experiment who could tuck himself inside its box, shielding itself from potential gunfire or threats, and the one who can jump anywhere it pleases, easily clearing fences, walls, or any other obstacles in its way. However, I believe Boxy's potential survival goes much deeper than just his ability to hide and escape. Consider the fact that he was the first ever bigger body. We officially learned this in Project Playtime, and in Chapter 4's ARG, his experiment number was finally revealed, Experiment 1160. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that Boxy was the first successful experiment overall. That title presumably belongs to 1006, the prototype, who, as we know from Chapter 3's ARG, existed as early as 1989. Unlike previous experiments, the prototype appears to be the first to use a human test subject, a milestone in Playtime Co.'s research, and in the Chapter 1 trailer, he's even described as a prime example of the vessel that Playtime was attempting to create. So, in the grand scheme of things, the prototype and Boxy Boo actually share two key similarities. They are both extremely violent, having killed multiple people each, and they are both special in their own ways. The prototype is the first true human-based experiment, and Boxy is the first successful bigger body. And if we look at the prototype's behavior, it becomes clear that he places significant importance on special experiments like himself. Just think back to his speech with Poppy. He clearly sees value in those who are like him.
I admit, though, I'm disappointed.
After all that time in your case, I'd hoped you'd see things
Differently. Don't you understand?
It's always been about you.
And we'll all be what we are.
So I wouldn't be surprised if the prototype has some sort of secret alliance with Boxy Boo. There's evidence to suggest that the prototype is willing to protect those he values. For instance, he sacrificed his own freedom to save orphan Theodore Grambell's life, and we can't forget that he has all the orphans living with him in the labs. Now, whether he actually cares about these orphans, or if he's just using them for his own twisted plans, is still unclear, but the fact remains, he has a pattern of keeping certain individuals close. Another major factor is that most evidence suggests Boxy Boo is actually a follower of the prototype. As we discussed earlier, Boxy participated in the Hour of Joy, and if he had revolted against the prototype at any point afterward, he likely wouldn't have survived. Why? Because Catnap, who we had previously concluded would most likely defeat Boxy in a fight, would have made sure he suffered the same fate as the other so-called heretics.
That thing, Catnap, the prototype is his god, and this is what he does to heretics.
So overall, it's not far-fetched to believe that the prototype has been keeping Boxy safe all this time. If that's the case, then right now, Boxy Boo could be lurking in the labs, waiting patiently for his next meal, which, if we're not careful, might just be the player. But there's even more direct evidence to suggest that Boxy Boo will make a full physical appearance in the future. Many fans found it strange that Boxy never had a proper cameo in Chapter 3, especially since it was the first chapter release after his debut in Project Playtime. His only appearances were in the form of posters and artwork. At the time, these small cameos led many to believe that Boxy was being teased for something bigger, perhaps even as a side antagonist in Chapter 4. Of course, as we now know, that never came to fruition. However, what if I told you that it wasn't always meant to be this way? YouTuber Sheep Rampage conducted an interview with the CEO of Mob Entertainment during the lead-up to Chapter 4. During this interview, he asked about the possibility of Boxy Boo appearing in the main game. The CEO suspiciously replied with, "Stay tuned to find out," adding a winky face. That heavily implies that Boxy Boo was originally planned to physically appear in Chapter 4, but plans ended up changing. Perhaps the final decision was to save his big moment for Chapter 5, the presumed grand finale of the main game. And wouldn't you know it, Chapter 4 contains far more explicit Boxy Boo teases than any previous chapter.
I mean, if the investigator finds evidence of this, it's his fault.
Hope Boxy's still...
Given all this evidence, it seems incredibly likely that Boxy Boo will be a side antagonist in Chapter 5, being one of the obstacles we have to face before reaching the prototype. What if I told you that Doey the Doorman isn't actually gone for good? I know what you're probably thinking. We all saw his final moments, crushed beyond what seemed like any hope of survival, but there are key factors that set Doey's bigger body form apart from the other experiments. And after closely analyzing these traits, I've come up with multiple theories that might just explain how and why Doey could make an unexpected return in the future. For a quick recap, we first come across Doey under rather disturbing circumstances. He violently tears Pianosaurus apart and devours his remains. Immediately, this sets the tone for what Doey is capable of. We then follow him for a while, working through puzzles as he shares to us snippets of lore. Ultimately, he guides us to a sanctuary called the Safe Haven, which is intended to protect the remaining toys from the ongoing dangers. It's at this location that we see how Poppy and Doey hold fairly different views on how to seek justice for those innocent lives taken at the hands of Playtime Co.
I think you might be wrong, Poppy. What you want...
It's the best for everyone, Doey. That no trace of this place is left. We agree to that.
I know, but us, everyone in there, we're not just things gone wrong. We're people. Can't you see that?
Regardless of these differences, we press on alone, facing Yarnaby and eventually having him burned to death, then ultimately dealing with his master, the Doctor. By the time we return to the Safe Haven, we've accidentally led the prototype straight to the others. In response, Doey steps forward to distract the dangerous entity so that we can join forces with Ollie and repair the generator. Having completed that task, Poppy urges us to plant explosives as part of her grand scheme to bring both the factory and the prototype to a definitive end. Yet, by the time we get back, we discovered that the prototype has already destroyed the hideout where Doey and the others once felt secure. Overcome with grief, Doey loses every ounce of sanity before he's crushed by a massive pile of debris, which triggers him to transform into this abomination of a monster. The sequence leads to a hectic chase scene and, eventually, a whole boss battle during where we appear to defeat Doorman once and for all, or at least that's what we've been led to believe. Now, one particularly interesting characteristic about Doey that sets him apart from every other experiment is his ability to squeeze through tight gaps. Beyond that, it's evident that Doey can completely disassemble certain parts of his body while retaining the ability to function as a living creature, basically defying the logic of these bigger bodies. Typically, these experiments are only able to stay alive because their vital human organs remain intact. Just look at Mommy Longlegs, for instance. She dies in seconds once her abdomen is crushed, taking out some of her crucial organs. Doey, on the other hand, doesn't seem to share this weakness. A vital clue here is Doey's much higher experiment number, which is 1322. By the time his experiment was in production, the scientists at Playtime Co. had likely gained more knowledge and refined their processes for constructing these bigger bodies. I mean, one year they were releasing a widely controversial toy line, and the next they were making giant living, breathing toy creatures. If you ask me, then it's pretty clear that Playtime was always evolving. Now, going back to Mommy Longlegs, she may offer a valuable comparison point as her entire body relies on an elastic plastic material to achieve that distinct stretchiness. Similarly, Doey's unique composition is heavily tied to the fact that he's basically made of Play-Doh, as stated in his toy commercial. This material explains his ability to reshape himself in ways that other experiments cannot replicate. Still, it raises an important question. How do these properties not mess with the organic systems that keep him alive? The answer likely lies in Doey's origin, because unlike most experiments which usually resulted from a single test subject, Doey was transformed from 3 different individuals. The first was a mischievous boy named Jack, who fell into a vat of dough during a factory tour. The second was a Playcare orphan named Kevin, known for his aggressive behavior and deemed a great experimentation candidate for how he excelled in all testing measures, both mental and physical.
Reflexes, reaction time, and mental fortitude all tested well above average in game station examination.
And the last test subject was Matthew, a teenage orphan who struggled with some personal issues, but also maintained a mature attitude, almost acting as a big brother toward younger children. By blending these 3 people, Playtime Co. essentially ended up creating Doey with probably significantly more organs than any typical experiment. However, he seems to lack in his amount of bones just based on some of his movements, which would explain his ability to fit through small spaces. He probably retained certain bones in his arms, allowing him to grip objects and move them around effectively, in contrast to Huggy Wuggy and Kissy Missy, for example, but that part isn't particularly important. When you think about it, Doey might have a system in which multiple hearts or other essential organs are scattered throughout his dough-like form, thanks to combining these parts of multiple test subjects. If he positions his body so that one part is separated from another, perhaps an alternate heart or another organ maintains blood flow, or whatever passes for circulation in an experiment like him. Meanwhile, the disconnected organ remains inactive until Doey reforms himself. Don't get me wrong, it's a bizarre concept, but it fits with the idea that Doey is the result of advanced experimentation, especially given the large jump in experiment numbers leading up to his creation. Then there's his uncanny ability to practically teleport through walls.
There's a safe place up ahead.
Even if it's not real teleportation, Doey may be able to reduce his shape to such a thin layer that he fits through the tiniest of cracks. We heard about a similar contorting ability during Chapter 3's ARG in regards to Catnap, who was experiment 11,088, but Doey's experiment number is even higher, so the scientists had more time to refine and enhance such capabilities. Whenever we see Doey perform this unique ability, we also notice him leaving behind bits of dough, suggesting that a lot of it is just excess material and he can afford to shed some of his mass without sacrificing his life functions, at least to a certain point. After too many transformations, he might lose so much dough that his body can't sustain its essential organs, leading to a slow and likely painful decline. This could be another unique property of Doey's. While other experiments could die thanks to too much blood loss, the same thing could happen to Doey by instead losing too much of his main material, Play-Doh. So how does this all tie into the question of whether Doey would come back in the future? Well, these realizations hint at the possibility that his supposed death might not be permanent after all, as they all explain certain events that occurred during the lead-up to his presumable death. To start with, his physical transformation powers could explain how he turns into a giant monster when he's overcome by emotional overload. He also endures being chainsawed on 2 separate occasions, only dissolving after a 3rd chainsaw strike, which could very well be due to all the extra organs he contains, which could act as spares. Even then, he reappears in his monstrous form, which might indicate that the dough he lost from these attacks was simply excess mass. Ultimately, Doey meets his apparent end by being crushed under a massive steel tube. However, there's still room to speculate that some of his additional organs, perhaps one of his hearts or brains, remained intact enough to slowly regenerate. This could have given Doey the power he needs to return in Chapter 5, angrier and more vengeful than ever. Despite being one of Chapter 4's most beloved new characters, Yarnaby's life is one filled with absolutely devastating tragedy. Even though his cute exterior and violent nature were standout features of his character, this dark backstory was always hanging in the background. In this video, we're gonna take a more in-depth look at the absolutely devastating backstory of Yarnaby. Like all the children of Playcare, a young boy named Quinn Davidson was taken to the game station and tested on his abilities. He scored low and little value was seen in him. Quinn wasn't like the other children. His behavior was very different and even concerning to the counselors. Regardless, the doctor, Harley Sawyer, still attempted to encourage him to do better through a simple conversation. Remarkably, this works. Through his words, Sawyer manages to get Quinn to improve under his watch, and then he goes on to become Experiment 1166. Despite a connection being between the two, Sawyer only speaks of Yarnaby in a demeaning way. He refers to him as it and uses other words such as pathetic and creature. To Sawyer, his subject is no longer Quinn, he's not even Yarnaby, he's just number 1166. While Yarnaby has next to no cognitive functions, he does possess great strength and loyalty, 2 things Sawyer uses to his advantage. Yarnaby is isolated from everyone but Sawyer to be his personal bodyguard. As Sawyer states, "By the time I'm done with it, I'll be its entire world." And sadly, this will prove to be true. Once Sawyer meets his own demise at the hands of Leith Pierre and Dr. White, Yarnaby is left alone and he feels it. Dr. Carmine McCabe reports on how he felt lost without his master, despite the apathy and poor treatment he received from Sawyer. He lacks any motivation or desire to do anything, he just waits hopelessly for his master to return. McCabe notes how this is proof that the little boy within Yarnaby, Quinn, is still there and grieving in the same way a human would. Ultimately, Yarnaby would die under orders to protect Sawyer. True to his word, Sawyer ensured Yarnaby would know nothing but him. His human life was taken from him, his world was limited to just him, and his final demise would be because of him. In a tragic irony, despite him being seen as a failure by Sawyer, Yarnaby was functioning exactly how he was supposed to be. His 1970s toy description was a lion with a heart of gold and a smile that touches your soul. Originally released as part of a wildlife conservation campaign in the 1970s, Yarnaby has seen regular releases in the years since. Believe us when we say Yarnaby wants nothing more than to make you his entire world. Yarnaby was supposed to be a constant companion and form of support for children. In his bigger body form, he would fulfill this role perfectly, but for the worst kind of person.
Would you wanna be my friend? Wow, aren't I glad to have a friend like you? Without someone like you to love, why, I think I'd just come apart at the seams.
Tragedy is something which follows all toys within the factory, so it's no surprise that Yarnaby isn't any different. However, his story also gives us an opportunity to discover more about Harley Sawyer and the lives of the toys as a whole. During the Chapter 4 ARG, we were shown a transcript of the conversation Sawyer had with Quinn. Here we can see that Quinn is an outsider, which makes him even more vulnerable. Sawyer says that he sees the real Quinn. When a child is an orphan, and in an orphanage as large as Playcare, it's very easy to see how a child may feel lost and alone. As a result, these small words could have a huge effect on a small child like Quinn, and this is the start of the undying loyalty which we see between the two. We saw a similar dynamic between Catnap Theodore and the prototype in Chapter 3. Whether in their toy forms or human bodies, these are children who are scared and alone, and that makes the idea of companionship in any form so desirable to them. Not only does this give us a real insight into how dark the story is within Poppy Playtime, but it's a great way to humanize the toys and put us in their shoes. Are we seeing animals run wild, or children who have been destroyed in the most vicious ways by people who swore to protect them? Yarnaby can also be used as a way of cementing the parallels between Sawyer and the DC villain the Joker. Both are maniacal and ruthless in their actions, and they also have sidekicks with unrelenting loyalty. Harley Sawyer has Quinn Davidson, and the Joker has Harley Quinn. Yes, it's that obvious. In both cases, the sidekicks have the vulnerabilities exploited in order for them to remain close to their partner. Interestingly, Yarnaby isn't the only character Sawyer has done this with. After Yarnaby's death, Sawyer nonchalantly introduces his other pet, Baba Chops. While we don't know anything about Baba Chops and her human life, we do know about her character description, which tells us a lot. The black sheep of the bunch, Baba prefers to keep her space. Like, a lot of space. Too much space. She can be distant, quiet, low energy, and it usually requires a lot of coaxing to get her out of the house. Luckily for her, she has some very persistent friends. She usually perks up after a while, but the next day, we're right back to the same tune. In a similar way to Quinn, Baba Chops is an outsider, and despite the fact that she is supposed to have friends, we don't see any around her in Chapter 4. If Yarnaby's bigger body is almost identical to his product description, it's not a reach to believe that Baba is the same. Sawyer is using his influence on both of them to manipulate them into doing what he needs. It doesn't matter who gets hurt, Sawyer will destroy everything to get what he wants. There's also another way in which Sawyer could be controlling his personal toys. Food. The toys are starving. It's one of the first things we see when we get to the factory. It's repeatedly written on the walls in Huggy's chase scene. It's constantly mentioned in reports on how the toys have an active digestive system, and the toys are heard complaining of their hunger in Safe Haven. Poppy herself even has to agree with what the prototype says about using the bodies from the Hour of Joy as food, as the toys would starve and die without them.
Doesn't make me feel better about the bodies, though. What he was saying about them? I know there's not really another option. The toys will starve otherwise. They'll die.
This use of hunger as a weapon can not only strengthen Yarnaby's loyalty to Sawyer, but also account for his intense violent nature. Not only are we a target in order to protect his master, but we're also an opportunity for food. Knowing that he could be forcibly subjected to a life of constant starvation for Sawyer's benefit only makes his circumstances even more tragic. While the other toys can't find food, even if Yarnaby could, there's a chance he wouldn't even be allowed to feed himself. The question could also be raised as to whether Yarnaby could even be saved. Poppy states how she only went ahead with the Hour of Joy as she wanted freedom. This is something that the toys themselves state over and over again. Doey states something similar, hence why he's against burning everything to the ground. If that were to happen, however, where would Yarnaby fit into all of this? Despite the fact that he would have been separated from Sawyer for many years, he has somehow been reunited with him and has gained a sense of motivation and joy. Being with Sawyer is his idea of freedom. This fact is excruciating, as you know that this freedom couldn't be further from the truth. He is being stuck as a prisoner in a cycle of abuse where he will only be used and disrespected. Yarnaby is an adorable lion who only wanted to fill the world with love and had his own life taken in more ways than one, and never got the kindness and love returned to him as he deserved. This kind of heartbreaking story is something we see throughout the series, and it's part of what makes the story so engaging, as many people can relate to it in some way or another. What if I told you that Huggy Wuggy wasn't just some twisted experiment, but was actually our creation? That we, the player character, are the very reason he exists. It sounds insane, but the deeper you dig, the more pieces start to fall into place. Clues hidden throughout the game not only support this theory, but also hint at what Huggy's real purpose might be in Chapter 5, and if this is true, then everything we thought we knew about him and our own role in this story is about to change forever. So we know Huggy has been repaired, but the real question is, why? He survived his fall into the depths of Playtime Co. and now seems to be out for revenge, but here's where things get strange. A now-deleted Discord message from Mob Entertainment's CEO all but confirmed that it was the prototype who fixed Huggy up, and that alone raises some major red flags. The prototype has a clear pattern. He doesn't just fix toys, he uses their remains for something sinister. We saw him drag away Mommy Longleg's corpse after her gruesome demise, and he did the same with Catnap, finishing him off after we set him on fire at the hands of our grab pack. This also proves that the prototype is willing to physically murder toys as long as they're already in a weakened state, rather than just waiting for them to lose full consciousness. After Huggy's brutal fall, the prototype had every opportunity to finish him off, but instead he chose to repair him. As for why, I believe the answer has something to do with a personal connection between Huggy and our player character. According to the Doctor in Mob's first story so far video on their YouTube, Huggy Wuggy had a very specific reason for being hostile in Chapter 1.
Our intruder stirred one of the factory's security measures, and he performed exactly as he was designed.
However, this may not actually be the case. Sure, Huggy Wuggy was officially Playtime Co.'s security guard, as confirmed by both the Orientation Notebook and the spin-off game Project Playtime, but this doesn't explain why he would still be carrying out the duties of his assigned role during the events of the game. In fact, that doesn't even make sense for a few key reasons. First, Poppy Playtime takes place in 2005, a full decade after the factory shut down, so why would Huggy Wuggy still feel the need to protect an abandoned facility? One possible explanation is that he's simply still following his initial orders due to his obedient personality.
Experiment 1170, Huggy Wuggy, remains the optimal outcome due to his sufficient intelligence paired with maximum obedience. End of log.
Although, as it turns out, Huggy Wuggy wasn't actually obedient at all, at least not according to the 12 Days of Playtime marketing campaign. This may even explain why he attempted to escape the factory in 1992. But there's another crucial factor to consider, one that further proves that Huggy's attack on us in Chapter 1 wasn't just a simple security measure. A real security guard would have immediately gone in for the kill rather than lurking in the shadows and stalking the intruder for extended periods of time, and yet that's exactly what Huggy does. He doesn't just try to eliminate us, he plays with us first, luring us deeper into the factory, forcing us to experience fear before making his move. This suggests that Huggy's primary mission wasn't only to kill us, it was also to torment us psychologically. And why would he specifically want to torment us? Perhaps as revenge for creating him. There's also one more eerie piece of evidence to consider. When the player first inhales the red smoke, they immediately find themselves in an intense nightmare. And who do we see at the very end of this vision? Huggy Wuggy, crawling out of a TV, chasing us down. Now, logically, Mommy Longlegs should have been the one to appear in this dream sequence. After all, she was far more prominent in Chapter 2 than Huggy was, and she was the most recent major threat the player faced. But instead, it's Huggy, depicted as even more demonic-looking entity than before. This heavily suggests that Huggy Wuggy is deeply ingrained in the player's subconscious. And what makes this even more unsettling is that throughout the nightmare, we hear radio reports about a disturbing discovery, one that could be directly tied to Huggy Wuggy's creation.
As of 9:45 a.m., local authorities report that the body of a young boy has been found on the estate of the late Elliot Ludwig, an esteemed toy maker and originator of the Playtime Company.
The key factor here is that the boy was missing key organs. This strongly suggests that his body parts were harvested to create one of the bigger body experiments, and considering what we know about Huggy Wuggy, he may very well be the experiment that resulted from this specific organ extraction. This theory also makes sense from a timeline perspective. The radio audio explicitly states that Elliot Ludwig was already dead by the time of the recording. Thanks to Leith Pierre's hiring opportunity letter to the Doctor, written at the beginning of 1990, it's known that Ludwig was dead at this time. In the letter, Pierre refers to himself as the head of the business, which implies that he's already taken over as Playtime Co.'s CEO, which was explicitly said in the Orientation Notebook. This is important because the Doctor was the one who originally proposed the idea of giant toys for free labor in the first place.
I'm here now with a solution. The Bigger Bodies Initiative.
The experiment form of Huggy Wuggy was a direct product of said initiative, meaning that Ludwig was already out of the picture by the time of Huggy's creation. This also strongly suggests that the dead child found at Ludwig's estate was planted there to frame him. And given the fact that this radio information was playing inside our head during the nightmare sequence, it means we must have had some involvement in all of this. However, I don't believe that our player character was directly responsible for the boy's actual death, or even for the act of framing Ludwig. There's simply zero evidence that the player had any personal grudge against Playtime's founder, but there is a well-documented history of bad blood between Ludwig and the Doctor. After being kicked out of the Young Geniuses program by Ludwig, the Doctor was completely devastated. He felt like the entire world was against him and came to view Ludwig as nothing more than a traitorous backstabber. So, what would be the perfect revenge? Framing Ludwig as a child murderer, completely defying his entire life's work. The Doctor kills a Playcare orphan, plants the corpse at Ludwig's home when he was no longer around to defend himself, and takes the children's organs back to Playtime Co.'s science team to use in an experiment. And this is where the player comes in. I believe that our character was one of the scientists working in Playtime Co.'s lab. In fact, Huggy Wuggy may have even been our first experiment, which would explain the significance put on his character. This would be all well and good if it wasn't for one glaring contradiction.
I can't say I remember seeing your face before, but I'm curious. Why come back?
If we closely worked alongside the Doctor during our time at Playtime Co., then it would surely make no sense for him to not remember us, unless, of course, he just had a bad memory. But considering that by this point he's essentially a computer, that seems highly unlikely. However, even if the Doctor claimed to not know us, it's still most likely that he was lying. Why? Because just seconds before he says he makes this claim, he openly acknowledges that Playtime Co. never truly recognized our value to the extent that they should have.
And to think Playtime had someone of such rare quality and never noticed. Funny.
So the Doctor probably knows who we are, he's just choosing to act like he doesn't. Not to mention, the Doctor literally describes us as special in the third story so far video. Another likelihood, however, is that he genuinely had forgotten about us given his self-absorbed personality. Plus, we can't forget that the orientation notebook mentions how the higher-ups barely interacted with staff. Either way, with everything we've uncovered, we can now safely conclude that we helped create Huggy Wuggy over 10 years before returning to his home. And what does this mean for Chapter 5? Well, the answer is fairly simple. Huggy will be more ferocious than ever. We already got a small taste of his unrelenting anger at the end of Chapter 4. The player was involved in his creation and, as a Playtime Co. scientist, was likely responsible for his pain and suffering. And if that wasn't enough, we sent him tumbling down from an insane height, leaving him for dead. All things considered, Huggy Wuggy now has every reason to want us gone for good. This is probably why the prototype specifically chose to repair him. Because if there's any toy who could successfully eliminate the player, it would undoubtedly be Huggy Wuggy. Why did Huggy Wuggy give us the key in Chapter 1? It seems like a simple question until you really start thinking about it. This is a creature that relentlessly hunts us down, yet before the chase even begins, he helps us move deeper into the factory. That's not just strange, it's intentional. After analyzing all the evidence, I've uncovered a chilling reason behind Huggy's actions, and once you see the full picture, you'll never look at Chapter 1 the same way again. But first, let's establish a well-known fact. Huggy Wuggy was designed to be Playtime Co.'s security guard, created with immense strength specifically for his role, and when we combine this with what the Doctor states in the first story so far video on Mob Entertainment's YouTube, the reason behind Huggy's aggressive behavior towards us should appear pretty obvious.
Our intruder stirred one of the factory's security measures, and he performed exactly as he was designed.
However, this can't be the true explanation for Huggy's hostility. If he was simply following his duty as Playtime Co.'s security guard, then why didn't he just kill us immediately? There has to be a deeper truth behind his actions. Of course, the Doctor wouldn't have realized this. As the creator of these giant toys, he likely wanted to believe that Huggy's attack on us was simply him doing his job just as he was designed to. That would be the most preferable explanation for him, but not necessarily the correct one. And as we previously mentioned, Huggy literally gave us the key. Clearly, he wanted us to venture deeper into the abandoned ruins of Playtime Co. Not only that, but he was also actively luring us in, starting off by stalking us from the shadows, subtly moving his arm to catch our attention, then by watching us from the vents, his eerie smile being visible before he silently disappeared. Unless that wasn't his intention at all, there's no denying that Huggy intentionally positioned his arm to retreat into the doorway, making sure we saw it. But his vent stare, that didn't directly push us forward, it didn't coax us into continuing rather than just running for the exit. I believe that in this instance, Huggy was simply stalking his prey, carefully analyzing when we'd be at our most vulnerable. And, in fact, we weren't supposed to see him at all. That moment wasn't a deliberate signal, it was just Huggy watching, waiting, and planning his ambush. That said, it's still clear that Huggy wanted us to make progress before attacking. His initial luring tactic proves that much. Now, one possible reason for him giving us the key was to ensure that when he finally struck, we'd be too deep inside the factory to escape. By that point, the front door would be far out of reach, leaving us trapped. If this was his plan, though, it means he completely overlooked the vent shaft, which we ultimately used to escape. But would Huggy, a toy designed with intellect and strategy in mind, really make a mistake like that?
Experiment 1170, Huggy Wuggy, remains the optimal outcome due to his sufficient intelligence paired with maximum obedience.
Given Huggy's intelligence, we can safely rule out the idea that he was simply trying to lead us further from the exit. Otherwise, he surely would have considered the ventilation as an escape route. So, what if his goal was something more personal? During the Hour of Joy, every toy was ordered to wipe out every adult in the building, guilty or innocent. Since the toys have the minds of children, they probably believed by the end of this event that all the grown-ups were responsible for their suffering. With this in mind, it's not far-fetched to think that when Huggy saw us, an ex-employee clearly well into adulthood, he may have ultimately viewed us as a monster, one of the very people who transformed him into this terrifying creature. If this was the case, then everything that followed in Chapter 1 could have been Huggy's twisted revenge, a way to mentally shake us to the core, torment us, and finally eat us alive, securing his own form of justice. However, there's also the opposite possibility. What if Huggy gave us the key because he was trying to help us? The recently played VHS tape explicitly mentioned how Huggy was obedient to Playtime Co. staff, and the only reason he participated in the Hour of Joy was because of the prototype's influence. Perhaps at first, Huggy wasn't trying to harm us at all, which would explain why he showed no hostility in the beginning. His later aggression may have been due to the prototype getting inside his head once again, forcing him to turn on us, and we already know the prototype is capable of this, as proven in the spin-off game Project Playtime.
See the location of every puzzle pillar. Protect them. Kill everyone in sight.
This theory, while interesting, is ultimately unlikely. Despite what the scientists believe, Huggy wasn't actually that obedient, something that was directly stated in one of Mob Entertainment's marketing campaigns. Plus, let's not forget, Huggy once escaped the factory and went on a violent killing spree. That doesn't exactly scream loyalty, does it? However, if you thought these possibilities were interesting, there is one more which is even more likely than any of the ones we've discussed so far. In fact, it even ties directly into Huggy's role in Chapter 5. There's a secret VHS tape hidden in Chapter 4, one that can only be found by opening a door with a keycard, which itself is hidden in the dark hallways during the Doctor's boss fight. The fact that this tape is so well hidden is proof of its importance to the plot, and as for its contents, well, it reveals a conversation between the Doctor and the prototype. From this, we learn that the prototype was working on some sort of project, one that he was using the Doctor's knowledge to complete. However, here's the key factor. The prototype needed something very specific to bring his project to life.
Fine, but you have no staff, virtually no test subjects. It's hardly ideal conditions.
What does this have to do with Huggy? Well, the prototype's project requires test subjects, and it makes perfect sense that he wouldn't want to use the orphans living inside the labs. After all, the entire purpose of the Hour of Joy, an event orchestrated by the prototype himself, was to protect the orphans from any further experimentation. But here's where it gets even more interesting. In the secret VHS tape, the Doctor specifically mentions that staff are also needed for this mysterious project. Of course, he himself no longer counts as staff since he's now a literal cyborg, but guess who does count? Our player character. It's been confirmed by Miss Delight in Chapter 3 that the player is human, and wouldn't you know it, they also just happen to be an ex-employee of Playtime Co. Suddenly, everything makes a lot more sense. The reason that the prototype hasn't killed us yet, and why Huggy only ambushed us after letting us progress deeper into the factory, maybe we weren't just a random target. Maybe we were being led somewhere for a much bigger purpose. Simply put, it's all been a test, but not a physical one. Rather, it's been an experiment on us to see if we're a worthy candidate. Huggy was ordered by the prototype to give us the key, ensuring we continue deeper into the facility, but why? Because this was a test of willpower and determination, a way to see if we would press forward or turn back when Huggy stalked our every move. Even the Doctor acknowledged our strength throughout the Story So Far series, and when it finally comes time for the chase sequence, it wasn't just an attempt to kill us, it was yet another test, a chance for the prototype to analyze our physical abilities after already determining that we were mentally strong. It would be a win-win scenario all around. If we were to fall to Huggy's wrath, it would prove that we were not good enough for the prototype's work, and if the opposite were to occur, it would only show just how worthy we truly are, and as we all know, we did escape Huggy in the end, proving ourselves to be an ideal test subject. Now, as for the explosion near Chapter 4's conclusion, it was probably just a trap, a way to lure us toward the labs where the prototype resides so he could finally get us exactly where he wants us. But that leaves one major question. Why was Huggy repaired? Well, we already know he wasn't acting on his own, he was following orders. The prototype didn't bring Huggy back just to hunt us, he brought him back to lead us even deeper, guiding us straight to the heart of the lab for the final stage of his experiment. And to think, it all started with a simple key. How exactly do toys in Poppy Playtime think? On the outside, they're just lifeless dolls, yet somehow they can process thoughts, make decisions, and even develop unique personalities. Some are highly intelligent, while others not so much. But how is that even possible? What's really going on inside their bodies? Well, the answer runs far deeper than you could possibly imagine. To truly understand it, we need to break it down character by character, because the explanation isn't the same for all of them. Let's start with Yarnaby, who relentlessly hunted us through Chapter 4 under the Doctor's command. According to documents, Yarnaby wasn't very smart, making him easy to manipulate and blindly loyal to the Doctor. This lack of intelligence might be directly linked to the orphan he was created from, Quinn Navidson. Quinn was never the sharpest tool in the shed, he was physically skilled, but his performance in Game Station's mental tests was consistently below average.
Welcome to Musical Memory. This advanced memory and cognitive recognition test is designed to stimulate several segments of the brain.
The key factor here is that even as a child, he could still be easily manipulated, which is exactly what happened when the Doctor convinced him to try harder at the Game Station tests, and when he did, his performance improved. This suggests that his susceptibility to influence was just a natural trait of his brain, one that carried over when he was turned into Yarnaby. Speaking of his brain, its placement raises a lot of questions. One of the biggest being, how does it not rip in half when Yarnaby opens his horizontal mouth? Well, what if his brain isn't actually in the usual spot? It's possible that Yarnaby's brain is located inside the yarn-covered portion of his body rather than within his head. And this wouldn't be the first time Playtime Co. placed an experiment's brain in an unorthodox location. Just look at the Doctor, whose brain was literally stored in a jar. If this theory is true, then Yarnaby's brain could be connected to the rest of his body through a network of veins and wires, some of which could run directly to the two sides of his face. These wires might be designed to move independently, allowing Yarnaby's face to split open without disrupting his brain's functionality. This would make Yarnaby a particularly unique experiment, one whose very biology defies traditional expectations. It could be a similar case with Huggy Wuggy, our old friend who we'll finally be reuniting with in Chapter 5. We don't know all the details about his experiment process, but we do know that he was intentionally designed to have immense strength, as he was meant to serve as Playtime Co.'s security guard. Now, some might argue that Huggy doesn't actually think, that he's just a mindless beast driven purely by instinct given how ruthlessly he attacked us during every encounter, but that could not be further from the truth.
Experiment 1170, Huggy Wuggy, remains the optimal outcome due to his sufficient intelligence paired with maximum obedience. End of log.
When considering this and the way that Huggy calmly stood in front of a house after escaping the factory, it becomes clear that Huggy Wuggy must have a functioning brain that allows him to think and feel. If he didn't, he would either be permanently aggressive or permanently docile, completely incapable of taking orders from anyone. But what if his brain isn't entirely biological? I know, it sounds impossible, but the evidence supporting this idea is actually more shocking than you might think. We already know that the prototype is a hybrid of organic and mechanical components. His claw contains visible mechanical parts, yet we also know he possesses a digestive tract, as confirmed by Chapter 1's trailer. So what if Huggy is built the same way? It's entirely possible that his brain isn't purely organic, but instead incorporates digitalized components, making him a biomechanical hybrid. The strongest piece of evidence for this comes from the spin-off title Project Playtime, where Huggy is telepathically communicated with.
See the location of every puzzle pillar. Protect them. Kill everyone in sight.
If his brain were completely organic, that surely wouldn't even be possible, so all the evidence points to it containing mechanical components. But after his fall into the depths, these parts may have been damaged or completely destroyed, leaving him with only the biological portions of his brain intact. If that's the case, it could end up playing a major role in Chapter 5's story, potentially explaining why Huggy acts the way he does when we finally encounter him again. Now, moving on to the nightmare critters, their biology is actually better documented thanks to Chapter 4's ARG, which provided us with experiment report notes. These reports strongly suggest that before the Bigger Bodies initiative was introduced, before giant toys like Huggy and Mommy Longlegs were created, Playtime Co. was first conducting experiments on miniature toys instead, such as the nightmare critters. Initially, their attempts at using systematic tissues to reactivate the subject's brain were unsuccessful. However, after further experimentation, they eventually figured it out, allowing the miniature experiments to actually live. Just like Huggy Wuggy, these smaller toys are not just mindlessly hostile, even if they appear to be. In fact, according to a marketing campaign from Mob Entertainment, these experiments once got along well with the smiling critters. This proves they can feel affection, meaning their brains must function just like any other sentient beings. And all of this was only made possible due to Playtime Co.'s extensive trial and error in perfecting their experiments, but this raises a huge question. How would fully functional brains even fit into such tiny toys? One possibility is that the brains were carefully reduced in size through delicate surgical procedures, removing unnecessary sections while keeping the crucial components intact. Alternatively, it's possible that these brains were never large to begin with. Instead, Playtime Co. could have sourced them from small test subjects. And let's not forget what we already know, Playcare had cribs. This confirms that babies were present inside the facility, and considering the horrors Playtime Co. has already committed, it wouldn't be far-fetched to assume that infants were used in the experiments as well. To make matters worse, if you listen closely to the Chapter 3 teaser trailer, the sounds of children screaming don't just belong to older kids. There are toddler and baby voices mixed in too. This brings us to another unsettling case, Boxy Boo, the very first of the Bigger Bodies. Unfortunately, his experiment note doesn't provide much insight into his biology. While an image of his blueprints was found in the Project Playtime ARG, it only seems to reference his toy version, not his experiment form, so it doesn't really help us here. What we do know, however, is that Boxy Boo was designed with a singular purpose, eliminating any employee who posed a threat to Playtime Co. His entire function revolved around consuming people, and according to the previously mentioned marketing campaign, he was nothing more than an all-around greedy jack-in-the-box. But here's where Boxy stands out from the rest. He doesn't seem to experience any real emotions. Unlike other experiments, he isn't driven by fear, anger, or loyalty. Instead, he's just a violent, insatiable predator whose hunger is never satisfied. And given the way his mouth opens, completely deforming his head in the process, this leads me to a bold conclusion. Boxy Boo has no brain. Unlike other bigger bodies, Boxy likely only possesses vital organs such as a heart and a digestive system. But when it comes to thinking and reasoning, he's completely incapable. He's just a mindless eating machine. Although it's a completely different story with our final toy, Doey the Doorman. As arguably the most biologically unique bigger body, Doey is clearly capable of feeling a wide range of emotions. In fact, his emotional instability is his defining trait. Throughout Chapter 4, he constantly shifts between different personalities, making his behavior highly unpredictable.
Hurt. Everything hurts. Hurt back. Always hurt back. Parents, scientists, everyone have to. My friends. He killed my friends.
This is because Doey was created using 3 different test subjects: a mature teenager, an angry child, and a mischievous kid who, unlike the others, was not an orphan. This fusion of 3 separate minds meant that Doey could never truly think straight, as at any given moment, one of his 3 consciouses would take over. But how is this even possible? Well, Doey's internal structure might be the most complex organic system out of any of the bigger bodies. The most logical explanation is that Doey retains all 3 brains from his original test subjects. The goofy child's brain is likely stored in Doey's head, as this personality seems to be the most dominant one seen throughout Chapter 4. The other 2 brains, belonging to the angry and mature personalities, are likely contained somewhere else inside his body. His biology may be designed so that only one brain at a time receives blood flow, allowing it to temporarily take control over his entire thought process. If this system is randomly timed, it would explain why Doey's personality shifts happen so suddenly and unpredictably. Ultimately, this means Doey only thinks using whichever brain is currently in an active state, making his thought system fundamentally different from that of any other experiment in Playtime Co. Poppy Playtime is packed with terrifying encounters with monstrous toys, but out of all of the horror-filled moments across all 4 chapters, which one is the scariest? To find out, we need to break down the most intense sections, because when we do, one moment stands out above the rest. To begin with, let's discuss one of the game's most iconic scenes. When Huggy Wuggy first emerged from the dark hallway, it shook players to the core. It wasn't just the shock of seeing this towering blue beast, its rows of razor-sharp teeth on full display, it was the sheer mystery surrounding him at the time. This was Chapter 1. Nobody truly understood the lore behind these giant living toys at the time. With all of these factors combined, it's no surprise that this scene has become one of the most iconic moments in horror gaming history, praised by both fans and critics alike for the sheer terror it delivers. But what follows right after this moment is even more infamous: the Huggy Wuggy vent chase scene. Even with 3 more chapters now available, many still consider this to be the best chase sequence in the game, and it's easy to see why. The developers brilliantly used the tight, claustrophobic vents to unsettle the player, forcing them to sprint blindly forward, all while a man-eating monster relentlessly pursues them. The sound design plays an equally terrifying role, disorienting players by making them second-guess whether the echoing footsteps they hear are their own or Huggy Wuggy's closing in behind them, and just when it feels like there's no escape, a storage box collapses a bridge, sending Huggy plummeting into the darkness. For most players, this moment comes as a huge relief, finally giving them a chance to breathe after experiencing such relentless terror. So it seems undeniable that this was Huggy's scariest moment in the game, unless we take a step back and remember his silent stalking throughout Chapter 1. After vanishing from the lobby, Huggy lures the player deeper into the building, revealing his presence with a simple movement of his arm from a doorway. This was the first hint that Huggy wasn't just some harmless statue, a realization that made many players freeze in fear, hesitant to move forward. And their reward for pushing through that fear? A chilling sight: Huggy's eerie, unblinking smile staring at them through a vent shaft before silently retreating into the darkness. This entire build-up made players feel constantly watched and, above all, unsafe. Chapter 2 may have amplified those feelings even further. After cheating our way out of a statues minigame, Mommy Longlegs loses her cool, revealing her true colors in a moment of pure rage and desperation.
Great cheaters! Now, we're going to play one last game! It's called Hide and Seek!
The jump scare where Mommy Longlegs intentionally drops into the room before this moment is enough to give players the fright of their lives, but the terror doesn't stop there. As Mommy spirals further into madness, she transforms into something that never should have been around children. Even her eyes turn black, a chilling detail that implies she is now completely dead inside, stripped of any remaining remorse or humanity. At this point, she's out for blood, nothing else. Players frantically flee the room as Mommy begins her countdown, the slowly opening door adding to the agonizing tension. There's no time to think, only to run for their lives and never look back. This alone proves just how terrifying this scene is for most players, and unfortunately for them, the horror doesn't let up after this moment either. Immediately after escaping, players are forced to navigate through pitch-black hallways, eerie ambient sounds filling the silence. At any moment, Mommy Longlegs could be lurking around a corner, waiting patiently for her prey to arrive. The sense of dread is overwhelming in this section, and somehow it only gets worse from here. By this point, it's crystal clear to the players that there's no reasoning with Mommy Longlegs. She's become nothing more than a psychotic, spider-like murderer, and her chase sequences hit even harder when you fully grasp just how far she's fallen. Some honorable mentions for other scary moments in Chapter 2 include the 3 minigames, each horrifying in its own way, but despite this, none come close to the pure terror that Catnap delivers. This jump scare alone is enough to make most players jump out of their skin, and who could forget the chilling moment near Chapter 3's conclusion when Catnap emerges from a doorway, breathing out his red smoke. By this point, players no longer have their gas masks, leaving them completely vulnerable. They feel defenseless, and that's exactly what Catnap is all about. But the true horror comes when the red smoke kicks in, causing the player to hallucinate Catnap as something far worse, a nightmarish, demonic-looking entity. As if things weren't bad enough, this terrifying version of Catnap becomes his permanent form for the entirety of his boss fight. Players must patrol the area, constantly checking the darkened hallways, making sure Catnap isn't lurking nearby, and all the while the gas keeps messing with their minds, causing them to see fake versions of Catnap everywhere. This forces players to rely on their flare gun, the only way to tell which Catnap is real, as if they weren't already stressed out enough. But this may not even be Catnap's most terrible moment. For that, we need to go all the way back to the first half of Chapter 3, which arguably features one of the most distressing sections in all of Poppy Playtime. Players find themselves trapped inside Home Sweet Home, wandering through its never-ending maze-like hallways. Everything looks the same, and it slowly dawns on them that there may be no way out of this place. And if that weren't bad enough, Catnap is stalking them the entire time, always watching from the shadows, really adding to the horror. To make matters even worse, some conveniently placed radios begin playing, amplifying the atmosphere even further.
In an upstairs bedroom in a large duffel bag, officers on scene report that the remains appear to have been disturbed. Organs, as well as key bones for the skeletal structure, were reported missing from the body.
It's no surprise that players felt relieved when they later learned that all of this was just a hallucination caused by the red smoke. However, what most certainly wasn't a hallucination was Miss Delight. She is often considered the most horrifying monster in Chapter 3, and her chase scene caused plenty of players to scream in terror as they desperately tried to escape her wrath. Her evil laughter only made the experience even worse, instilling a deep comfort in many. But if we're talking about true discomfort, then Dog Day's death easily takes the top spot. It wasn't necessarily scary in the traditional sense, but it was undeniably disturbing, and that left many players speechless. So, with 3 chapters down, that leaves just one question. Does Chapter 4 live up to the horror? Well, one thing's for sure. This chapter introduced the largest number of characters yet, such as Yarnaby, a yarn-covered lion that players had to stealthily avoid because otherwise. Yeah, Yarnaby's mouth can open horizontally, disturbingly enough, but despite this and his gagging noises, his scenes may not have been the scariest in Chapter 4. The same can be said for Baba Chops, the Nightmare Critters, and even Pianosaurus for obvious reasons. Now, the Doctor is a character who becomes far more terrifying when you consider his backstory. After all, he was literally turning orphans into monsters to use them as free labor, but in Chapter 4 itself, Rather than facing us head-on, he mostly just sends his minions after us, which means he isn't personally presented as a particularly scary character. That said, his robots do chase us through the darkness, and many players found this section genuinely terrifying, even if it doesn't quite match the intensity of some other horror moments. As for Doey the Doorman, he began as an ally, but when the prototype destroyed Safe Haven, killing all of Doey's friends in the process, he completely lost control. This ultimately led to him becoming the final boss of Chapter 4, one that we had to tragically kill ourselves. With all this being said though, the absolute scariest moment is undoubtedly the Home Sweet Home hallucination sequence in Chapter 3. It delivers a completely different type of horror, one that's far more psychological than anything we've come to expect. Believe it or not, the prototype isn't out to get us, at least not yet. In fact, he might not even need us at all, and I'm going to tell you why. As the expected final boss of Chapter 5, our mission is clear. Rescue the orphans, blow up the factory, and take down the prototype. But here's the strange part. Despite everything, he's kept us alive throughout the past 4 chapters. Some believe it's because he needs us for something, but is that really true? I don't think so. Getting to the bottom of this might reveal some huge story details in Chapter 5, so let's break down all the evidence and see what we're really dealing with. For starters, Mob Entertainment's website strongly suggests that Catnap only attacked us because the prototype ordered it. Then, not long after we arrived, Safe Haven was completely destroyed, almost like the prototype was sabotaging us on purpose. And if that weren't enough, there's solid evidence that he was the one who repaired Huggy Wuggy, likely to make sure Huggy finished the job after failing the first time. But things take an even darker turn when we take a look at a VHS tape from Chapter 4. One that hints the prototype was searching for test subjects.
Fine, but you have no staff, virtually no test subjects. It's hardly ideal conditions.
The doctor mentions that the prototype has no staff, implying that he needs them for whatever project he's working on. What makes this even more interesting is that our player character is a former Playtime co-employee, fitting this staff criteria perfectly. So, if that's the case, why wouldn't the prototype use us for his work? Well, the doctor may have indirectly answered this question in Chapter 4.
It appears you are every bit what the prototype fears. And to think Playtime had someone of such rare quality and never noticed. Funny.
Somehow, and for some reason, our mere presence seems to intimidate the prototype. Now, sure, by the end of Chapter 4, he doesn't appear to be even slightly afraid of us, but that could have easily been an act. After all, it's not like the prototype, a being with an enormous ego, would ever openly show fear. In fact, during Chapter 3, he was blatantly complimenting himself while imitating Ollie, reinforcing just how highly he thinks of himself. So what exactly is our character's deal, and how does it connect to the prototype? Well, the conclusion I've reached is more shocking than you could possibly imagine. There are multiple moments in the game where the player is able to casually get back up after experiencing something that should have been near fatal. This strongly suggests that we might be some kind of mega experiment, one far stronger than most others. Think back to Chapter 1 when we dropped a storage box on Huggy Wuggy, causing him to fall and collapse the bridge. We also fell, landing hard on a catwalk, yet somehow we got out completely fine even though a fall from that height should have shattered our legs. Then in Chapter 4, we fall even further, landing face first on hard rock, and we still end up walking away unscathed. Meanwhile, Huggy, who was literally designed to be physically powerful as stated in the orientation notebook, was visibly injured from his plummet as we see in Chapter 4's ending. And yet, despite all of this, it has been confirmed that the player is, in fact, human.
Not a good listener, are you? You're not like the other humans in that way.
Miss Delight may not have realized, however, that something about us is different. Even the doctor believed as much, and if he suspected it, he likely had a good reason. Considering the doctor had been watching us throughout our whole journey in the factory, he would have seen us survive these near-fatal experiences like long falls that should have been impossible to walk away from. This alone would have made it clear to him that something about us isn't normal. But the biggest clue comes from something he says in the third Story So Far video on Mob Entertainment's YouTube, a line that reveals something huge about the player.
And our intruder, there's something special indeed.
Considering all this evidence, here's my theory. A shocking one that the player isn't just human, they're an experiment. One so convincing even Mr. Light was fooled. It might sound far-fetched at first, but there's even more proof. Evidence that could explain exactly why the prototype fears us. For starters, Playtime Co. was clearly experimenting with human-looking bigger bodies at some point. Just look at Mr. Light. The key difference, however, is that she was visibly made of plastic, something easily noticeable at a glance. But what if, after further testing, the scientists figured out how to create an exceptionally strong experiment that looked exactly like a normal person? And what if that experiment was us, the player? This would tie into how Mummy Longlegs seemed to recognize us back in Chapter 2. If we were just some random ex-employee, there wouldn't be any obvious reason for her to know who we are. But if we were originally part of Playtime Co.'s science department, it would mean we had direct knowledge of the experiments and the game station. And here's the kicker, this wouldn't be the first time a Playtime Co. employee volunteered to become a test subject.
Test subject is 59-year-old Thomas Clark, a full-time employee at Playtime Co. since 1955. 6 months ago, he was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. Now, Mr. Clark, of sound mind, has volunteered for this experiment.
What makes this even more compelling is that Clark became a toy specifically in an attempt to save his own life after being diagnosed with terminal cancer.
We have eye movement. Can you hear us, Thomas?
Now, while the player may not have had the exact same reasoning, it's entirely possible that they chose to become a human-looking experiment simply to gain enhanced strength and longevity. This would also explain how the player managed to survive in the outside world for 10 years after the factory shut down, because to everyone else, they would have appeared as a completely normal person. And as for the doctor knowing this secret, that makes perfect sense when we consider that he was once our co-worker. So, what does all this mean for the prototype's opinion on us? Well, it's highly possible that he fears us, because for all he knows, we might actually be stronger than him. If our character truly is the most powerful experiment Playtime Co. has ever created, the prototype may be avoiding a direct confrontation with us out of self-preservation. That could explain why he never fights us himself. Instead, he secretly follows us through the factory, only ever revealing his claw when we defeat a toy whose corpse he could use for his own twisted project, possibly adding them onto his body to enhance himself beyond our level of power. However, it's important to note that the prototype is not just some scared, weak experiment, as all this may imply. His past actions prove otherwise. When he worked alongside orphan Theodore Graham Bell in an attempt to escape the facility, he ultimately sacrificed his own freedom to save the boy's life, delivering him to the employees, even though it inevitably meant being locked up once again. This moment shows that the prototype does possess courage, and quite a lot of it, so then why doesn't he use us for anything? Why doesn't he try to eliminate us directly? The answer is simple, because we're a greater threat than he is. Until he transforms himself into something truly unstoppable, his only option is to keep sending more and more toys after us, hoping that one of them will succeed. However, deep down, he probably knows they won't, but it's not like he actually cares about his followers anyway. With that in mind, it's likely that Chapter 5's main toy antagonist will be one of the prototype's disciples. Now, this may seem to contradict what Poppy told us.
Catnap is coming. He's the final obstacle the prototype has placed against us. We can't stay here. Keep yourself safe.
However, Poppy was wrong about Huggy being dead, which invalidates most things she said during that same speech. Chapter 4 of Poppy Playtime brought us new characters, deeper lore, fresh mysteries, and even more secrets. Just when you think you've seen it all, there's still plenty to find from the seemingly abandoned toy factory. Today, I'm going to show you 10 things you missed in Chapter 4. The lore of Poppy Playtime has often relied heavily on dialogue between characters, and this chapter is no different. We get to see tapes featuring reoccurring characters such as Rich and Leith Pierre, but we're also introduced to previously unseen ones such as the elusive Eddie Ritterman and Dr. Bruno White. However, it's not just from these tapes that we can uncover fresh details pertaining to the lore. Like in Chapter 3, we're occasionally exposed to the infamous red smoke, which is known for inducing hallucinations, something that we've been subjected to ourselves. During our first encounter with the smoke, various lines can be heard in the background which appear to be remnants of a conversation. We faintly hear, "I've had it with this place. I'm out of here. I'm not afraid of you anymore." Now, while this is not the same format as the usual tape dialogues, considering this is a very limited selection of a conversation, it has a tremendous impact on what it could mean for the lore. Shortly after Chapter 3 was released, the Orientation Handbook was also released, introducing us to a character named PW. Since then, his character has been a key candidate for the identity of the character. At the back of the handbook, we see that PW tried to quit on the 3rd of August, but was convinced to stay. The snippet of this conversation lines up with these events, which potentially could be providing us more evidence that we're playing as PW. Regardless, it's a great piece of information to have, and due to its faint sounds, which are also obstructed by heavy background noises, it's not surprising that many players may have missed this. Another secret which gave us further insight into a character is the hidden room of Dr. Harley Sawyer himself. Players may have missed this room as the keycard to access it was guarded by 2 of Sawyer's robots. However, if you were able to grab the keycard and enter the room, you were exposed to a plethora of lore. The main piece of evidence which stood out was the tape between Sawyer and the prototype titled Time. This is important for 2 reasons. One, we learn that despite the two seeming to be at odds with each other in the previous chapter, they're now working with one another. However, you could hardly call this a harmonious reunion. 2. Both the title of the tape and its contents give a huge insight into what the prototype is working towards. He's continuing the experiments which were done during the Bigger Bodies initiative, and most importantly, he's running out of time. We can only speculate as to what this means and how it's going to impact the story in Chapter 5, but it's still fascinating to know nonetheless, and gives us a further understanding of both the prototype and Harley Sawyer. The room also shows notes which were found in the Chapter 4 ARG, specifically the letter where Elliot Ludwig removed Sawyer from the Young Geniuses program many years ago. It shows us that Sawyer's arrogance and hubris have always been a fundamental part of his character, which ultimately led to his own downfall. A radio in the room cements this fact even further by blatantly showing Sawyer's recklessness and complete disdain for the children from his own mouth, asking things such as what would they have been otherwise, as if these are not real living, breathing children. There are also moments outside of Sawyer's room which gives us more of a look into his character. While this was discussed during the Chapter 4 ARG, more information was given during Chapter 4 with the 93 Theater incident tape. Little is known about this specific incident outside of it being the final straw for Sawyer and ultimately leading to his demise. If players were able to find this tape, they would get an insight into the scale of the incident as it killed a minimum of 78 people. It's not all doom and gloom though. Since Chapter 1, a fairly innocuous lemon can be found throughout the factory. It has been referenced on death scenes, seen in key moments of the series, and even has its own voice lines. Limon returns once again in Chapter 4, both in 2D and 3D formats. The former can be seen drawn on the wall in Safe Haven, but the latter can be found at the start of the game when the player makes their way down to the prison and encounters Sawyer and his incredibly unfriendly pets for the first time. If you remove the wood panels which are covering a hole in one of the prison rooms, if you turn to your right, you can see everyone's favorite citrus fruit with more voice lines and adorable eyes added. Another adorable character also has a few details many may have missed. If you look closely at Yarnaby's body with a free camera, you can see that he's covered in scars. Where these cuts and injuries came from, we don't know, but we can certainly make some guesses. We know that Yarnaby and Sawyer were separated after Sawyer's removal, but we also know that Sawyer had already forced Yarnaby to be his guard cat prior to this. This means that Yarnaby could have been subjected to numerous tests and even abuse to ensure that he would be strong enough to protect his master. It could also imply that Yarnaby played a role in the Hour of Joy. We're not entirely sure where he was and whether he had any part in the killings, but the extensive scars over his body could certainly be good evidence to point to him being involved in some way. There are also other moments in Chapter 4 which give us a huge amount of information despite potentially being easily missed by players, especially if they weren't directly looking for lore. For example, the small pieces of dialogue we get from the toys tells us so much. In Safe Haven, you have a number of smaller versions of the smiling critters. These versions seem far more cognitive than their larger predecessors and are actually alive. We hear them make references to us, the player, the doctor, and their chronic and painful hunger and, interestingly, their disdain for Poppy. Throughout the series, we've seen repeated hostility toward Poppy from those in the factory. Of course, we're not sure why, but there are even more details which build on this, which we'll discuss later. Another great source of information which players may have missed is the art on the walls of Safe Haven. The art gives us an eerie sense of the mindset of the toys and acts as a tool for them to vent their frustrations and relay their memories. Remember, not all the toys can speak, so this could be their only way to communicate. For example, we see the children draw themselves surrounded by red smoke and Catnap begging for help and repeatedly screaming no. This shows us that some of the kids vividly remember their lives before their transformation and the process itself. This is also something Doey himself would confirm due to his chronic fear of the gentle voices which were played during the experiments as a sick way to soothe the kids. There's also a giant drawing of the hand of the prototype dangling a child by their leg, showing that the prototype is still very much despised by some of the toys, despite his attempt to kill all those he deemed traitors. Again, we see more references to the ongoing hunger of the toys, how they miss their parents, and their hatred for Poppy. From the very first chapter, we see that whoever is in the factory does not have a good opinion on Poppy. Her room is covered with graffiti telling us to go back, the vent where Huggy chases us has writing saying stay away from her, she can't be trusted, and a few more. Well, chapter 4 is no different either. On the same wall art, we see an image of Poppy which is furiously crossed out stating how she left us, them, despite the fact that they needed her. While this does give us some additional context as to why the other toys may hate Poppy, it does seem like a direct contradiction. The wall art suggests that the toys in Safe Haven don't know where she is. However, we know that there are toys in the factory who know exactly where she is, and they're doing all they can to warn people away from her. We won't know the full truth until the end of the series, but for now, this is a great piece of information which tells us more about the namesake of the franchise. The dark themes of Poppy Playtime don't end there, however. We finally get a rare sight of toys eating what appears to be chicken, but it's not. It's Dog Day. Yeah, the toys are engaging in full-blown cannibalism either out of necessity or sick desire. Like Riley, Dog Day also had a skeletal structure allowing for him to have meat which toys are feasting from. It's not just Dog Day who's subjected to this though. We're introduced to Doey by him viciously grabbing Pianosaurus and having his first meal in weeks. But how? Out-of-bounds footage showed Doey's multiple extended arms reached out to grab the musical dinosaur and throw him around the room before he was finally consumed by Doey. Although he never fully transitioned into his monster form, it was still really cool to see how those features of Doey's monster form were seen so early on in the chapter. Yes, Chapter 5 of Poppy Playtime really might change mascot horror forever. After all, this series has already proven it's willing to push boundaries and violence, gore, and disturbingly dark themes, but if you think you've seen all of it, brace yourselves because every piece of evidence I've found points to this next installment being the most insane release yet. Let's break it all down. To start with, we can't ignore the simple fact that going in a darker direction has led Mob Entertainment to huge success. Many fans consider Chapter 3 to be the turning point for Poppy Playtime, and it's arguably the most successful and popular chapter of the entire game, receiving endless praise from even critics. From a business perspective, it makes perfect sense why Mob Entertainment doubled down on this approach in Chapter 4, and why they'll likely push it even further in Chapter 5. Beyond that, there's a clear pattern, with each chapter getting progressively darker in every way. For comparison, Chapter 1 is in many ways your typical first release in a horror game that's building up to something much bigger and more ambitious. There are a few patches of blood, some eerie horror elements, and a pretty scary chase scene and VHS tapes introducing the main characters.
Hi, my name is Leigh Pierre, and I'm the head of innovation here at the Playtime Co. Toy Factory.
Other VHS tapes and posters provide subtle lore hints about things like the Hour of Joy and the orphans being experimented on. However, these are extremely vague, meaning that most players wouldn't catch on to these disturbing revelations during their first playthrough. But this completely changes in Chapter 2. By the time players go through all the documents, it becomes crystal clear. The game station isn't just a play area, it's a testing facility. a place where children were evaluated before their eventual toy conversion. It's obvious that Mob wanted the story to take a much heavier turn with this chapter, and if that wasn't enough, the increase in blood and brutal scenes like Mommy Longleg's horrifying death sent a loud and clear message. Even players who weren't actively hunting for lore could tell this game was only going to get darker from here, and sure enough, those implications absolutely lived up to the hype. Over a year after the release of the spin-off game Poppy Playtime, Chapter 3 finally arrived, and just one look at its many eerie environments made it immediately clear. Something was different. Even without knowing the full story, you could feel it in the atmosphere. This abandoned orphanage was a place where horrible things occurred, and this time there was no need for subtle hints. The VHS tapes in Chapter 3 directly confirm that Playcare's orphans were indeed being used as test subjects in twisted toy experiments.
Subject is stable. Designated 1322. Clear neural abnormalities were detected in his recent checkup.
And we can't forget about the Hour of Joy's official reveal, or the horrifying characters introduced in Chapter 3, like Miss Delight, who ate the other teachers before the game's events. As if that wasn't enough, we also got Catnap, a menacing purple feline who breathes out hallucinogenic gas, which would put the orphans to sleep every night. We even had to use a gas mask throughout the chapter just for self-defense from his lingering smoke. With all of this combined, it's no surprise that Chapter 3 is often regarded as one of the scariest installments in mascot horror history. That being said, the most recent entry, Chapter 4, was without a doubt the darkest installment yet, exactly what it was promised to be during its marketing, and its main location, a literal prison where the toys were locked away like caged animals. For the first time, actual human corpses could be found scattered throughout the map. We learned more about the catastrophic theater incident, and to top it all off, the main antagonist, Harley Sawyer, aka the Doctor, was literally the man behind all these experiments. But perhaps the most tragic and darkest moment of all was Doey the Doorman's downfall. His entire world crumbled right before our very eyes. 12 years prior to the game's events, he had killed his own parents after his transformation into Doey, and during the events of Chapter 4, every toy friend he had spent his life protecting was slaughtered with the destruction of Safe Haven, all at the hands of the prototype. So, with each chapter growing darker and darker, there's only one question left. What's next for the game?
If you're seeing this, you must be very, very lost. Well, rest assured, friend, our state-of-the-art laboratory is just up ahead.
Chapter 5 will take place in the labs, a location that was foreshadowed all the way back in Chapter 2. It also happens to be the home of the prototype, the game's main antagonist, who's been teased since the very beginning, and I mean that literally, as his very first mention was literally in a trailer before the release of Chapter 1. Furthermore, we can definitely expect to see more bodies as well, since Poppy explained that they were dragged to the factory's depths after the Hour of Joy. Sure, most of the corpses were eaten, but that didn't stop us from seeing many of them in Chapter 4. Not to mention, this was literally the birthplace of these monstrous toy creations. If there's any part of Playtime Co. where we can expect to see truly awful, hideous sights, it's here. And let's be honest, if Chapter 5 really is the finale, there's no way they're going to let our final hours in this nightmare of a factory feel even remotely pleasant. It's safe to assume that there will be little to no comedic relief with characters such as Doey, if any at all. On top of that, there are still so many unanswered questions, such as, was Elliot Ludwig guilty or innocent? How exactly did the toy conversion process work? What's the truth behind Poppy's creation? Who's the prototype? What was our player character's true role at Playtime Co.? And these are just a few examples. With Chapter 5 and its upcoming ARG, we'll likely get the answers we've been waiting for, along with even more dark story elements to unravel. We can also expect a potential new book before any of the next chapter's promotional marketing material begins, as developers have mentioned the idea in recent interviews. This could also give us some more insight into these mysteries, but what about the game's ending? Well, I highly doubt it'll be a happy one. The prototype just seems far too powerful. His intelligence, manipulative tactics, and uncanny ability to stay one step ahead make him feel nearly unstoppable, at least not without sacrifices being made.
I let him away, didn't I? The generator's fine. It's...
The most likely scenario is that we'll be faced with a major choice at the conclusion of Chapter 5, one that will ultimately determine how the story ends. During Chapter 3's development, a developer hinted at the possibility of multiple endings in future installments, and we already got a small taste of this concept in Chapter 4 when players were given the choice to either kill the mini nightmare critter to escape a room or sneak out through a vent instead. Looking back, it seems like that moment was almost a trial run for something much bigger coming in Chapter 5, and this would be a big step forward for the franchise, something it's never tried before. So what would this decision look like? By the time we reach Chapter 5's final section, the factory may once again be rigged with explosives, either by us or a new ally, and when the time comes, we may have to make a devastating choice. Blow up the factory, sacrificing ourselves along with every living toy, who, mind you, are technically children, as well as the orphans trapped inside the labs. Now, I know part of Poppy's mission is to save the orphans, but her plans haven't exactly worked out as intended up until this point, so our only other option could be attempting to escape, leaving the factory intact and never truly bringing justice to all those who suffered under Playtime Co. It sounds like a lose-lose scenario, doesn't it? And ultimately, that's exactly the point. Poppy Playtime's story has never been one of sunshine and rainbows, so it only makes sense that Chapter 5, as the probable final chapter, will go above and beyond, being darker than anything we've seen yet. Who was really behind the destruction of Safe Haven? While the prototype seems like the obvious suspect, looking closer at the evidence suggests another force, or maybe even someone else entirely, could be responsible. After going through all the clues, I think I've uncovered the true mastermind behind this mystery. To get to the truth, let's start by ruling out the less likely theories and work our way toward the strongest one, beginning with why the prototype may not have been responsible despite the game's implications. One crucial detail stands out: the safe haven remained intact until we arrived. If the prototype had truly intended to destroy it, why would he have waited so long? On top of that, the sanctuary's destruction appears to have been caused by an explosion, yet the prototype couldn't have used the explosives we had planted for such a task, since he explicitly states that he stole them to collapse the ground beneath us and Kissy Missy.
I've taken the liberty of retrieving those explosives from the Foundation. Thanks for collecting them.
Those aren't the way. I've put them to good use.
I'll find her.
As for you two, try to land on your feet.
As far as we know, the prototype does not possess any natural ability to cause explosions. This raises the possibility that another opponent, or perhaps a completely new character set to be revealed in Chapter 5, was responsible. However, there is currently little evidence supporting that idea. Instead, let's turn our attention to an already established character, Pianosaurus. Now, I know what you're thinking. He's dead, plain and simple. But what if, during Chapter 4's events, the prototype, using his known intelligence, managed to repair him, similar to how he may have revived Huggy Wuggy? Well, it may seem unlikely. Keep in mind that Pianosaurus received notable attention in Chapter 4's promotional material, appearing in an encoded image during the ARG and even having an entire teaser video dedicated to him. It feels off that Mob Entertainment would build up his presence this much only for his role to be reduced to a 20-second cameo and a single lore document. What if he returns in Chapter 5, battered and damaged, and it's revealed that he was responsible for the Safe Haven's downfall all along? Plus, having him return would also be a good choice for Mob from a business perspective, given all the love he's received from fans. Alternatively, if he is truly gone, then maybe one of his fellow musician toys is to blame. According to the Poppy Playtime merch store, Pianosaurus was released as part of a set featuring other musical toys, one of whom might have destroyed the safe haven to avenge their fallen friend. However, there isn't much concrete evidence to support this theory, but there is stronger proof suggesting that Pianosaurus himself could be the true culprit. A document about him found in the game states that he was designed for a role similar to Experiment 1160, Boxy Boo, whose primary task was to get rid of any employees or tourists who may have seen the wrong thing.
Now, we need to start tailoring that appetite of yours to flesh.
This directive resulted in Boxy developing an aggressive and hostile personality. If the same applies to Pianosaurus, just considering he was meant to have a similar job, it would explain why he immediately charged at us upon first sight. This violent nature could have played a role in the destruction of Safe Haven, possibly fueled by desire for vengeance against Doey the Doorman, who was responsible for his demise before being rebuilt by the prototype. Doey not only killed Pianosaurus, but also deeply cared for the Safe Haven and its residents, making him a prime target for revenge.
The toys out there in Safe Haven, they're my family.
But if Pianosaurus isn't the one to blame, another unexpected suspect emerges: Poppy. Although she's not the most likely culprit, there is still decent evidence suggesting she's guilty. For starters, Poppy and Doey clearly had opposing viewpoints on how to handle the prototype and all the horrific events that occurred at Playtime Co. in general. Doey even called her out for abandoning him and the other toys, despite her claims that she had no choice but to leave. But why does this matter? It's likely that being frustrated with Doey's defiance, Poppy may have orchestrated the Safe Haven's destruction, not necessarily to kill its inhabitants. I mean, we saw how displeased she was upon finding out that we killed Doey ourselves.
You! What did you do? Why did you kill Doey? Do you even understand what happened?
She may have just done it to force Doey and the other toys to flee out of fear and grief, removing them from the equation, thus allowing her to continue on with her own plans without bother. This would align with her often selfish tendencies, which were evident when she diverted the train to trap us in the factory so she could use our help for her own agenda. Furthermore, her complete lack of acknowledgement for the Safe Haven's destruction when we reunite with her near Chapter 4's conclusion could indicate that she knew exactly what happened because she was the one responsible. The most concerning part of this theory is that when Doey rushed outside to confront the prototype and never returned, Poppy showed little concern and immediately changed the topic to get us to further help with her plan. Typical Poppy.
No word from Doey. Whatever happened out there? No, he's fine. I'm sure of it. We shouldn't wait anyway. Head for the Foundation. Plant the explosives.
It was as if she didn't care about him at all, which further suggests that she may have played a role in the hideout's demise. However, there's still one major question. How could a small plastic doll possibly cause destruction? Unfortunately, there's not much definitive proof explaining how she would have physically carried out such an act. It's possible that she had Kissy Missy destroy the hideout. After all, Kissy is incredibly strong, as demonstrated during the Hour of Joy, and seems to blindly follow Poppy's instructions. This idea remains very speculative though. Besides, there's no hints as to how Kissy would have set it on fire and whatnot anyway, so due to the lack of strong supporting evidence, I don't believe Poppy was responsible. There is one more suspect that I believe is the most likely, and that character is us, the player. I know how crazy that sounds, but our character already appears to have a not-so-great track record. I mean, they literally murdered a bunch of living toys literally made from orphans, so how could we be responsible for this disaster? The key moment to recall is when we had to repair the generator with Ollie's assistance. At the end of the chapter, it was revealed that Ollie was actually the prototype mimicking a child's voice. Given the prototype's nature, it's hard to believe he would truly help us fix something that benefits his enemies. That's why I don't think he did, at least not in the way we thought. And if you're following my reasoning, you might think this contradicts the whole idea of this video, but there's an important difference. While the game suggests the prototype directly caused the wreckage, this theory argues that he actually tricked us into doing it for him. This wouldn't be the first time the prototype used others to do his dirty work. Who could forget the Hour of Joy? In short, I believe the prototype rigged the generator to explode after a set time, knowing we would unknowingly trigger the destruction, sabotaging our own allies in the process. He may have tampered with the generator's inner workings through the walls and set the trap that way. Otherwise, if he had direct access to the safe haven, he likely would have destroyed it himself right away, and since we know the prototype is a technological genius, it makes sense that he could have pulled this off.
The prototype seemingly disassembled the digital alarm clock within his room and utilized the battery, along with several other components, to create a laser pointer, which he then fired into the security camera, disabling it.
Just to provide more evidence, it should be considered how strange Ollie sounded after the generator was supposedly fixed. If this theory is correct, it would explain his suspicious tone of voice during that moment.
It's done. I didn't. Good.
So, what does this mean for Chapter 5? If we were indeed tricked into unknowingly destroying the safe haven, it means we need to be incredibly cautious about any contraptions we interact with moving forward. Who knows? The prototype may have set up countless traps within other machines, ensuring that anyone who tries to oppose him ends up assisting him instead. Can Huggy Wuggy actually be killed? We sent him crashing into the abyss, his blood smeared across the pipes on the way down. That should have been it. And yet, 3 chapters later, he's back. Not just alive, but repaired. So, is Huggy Wuggy truly unkillable? After digging through every clue, I may have finally uncovered the truth, and to find out, we need to break down the evidence. Both the proof that Huggy can't be stopped, and the shocking details that say otherwise. For starters, Huggy was built to be indestructible. His raw strength alone proves that, but if that's not enough, just listen to what Leith Pierre's assistant reveals in the Phase 2 Survivor tutorial from Project Playtime.
Pretty sneaky for a 10-foot tall giant, isn't he? Do your best to avoid him.
For Huggy Wuggy to be this tall, it means his body contains far more components than most other bigger body experiments. This alone proves that a huge amount of force would be required to truly hurt him, and we get a perfect example of this in Mob Entertainment's YouTube video, Restricted Disappearance. In the footage, Huggy spots an exit and escapes the building, only to be surrounded by retrieval vehicles sent to bring him back.
Okay, we see him. Brace yourselves, everyone.
With no other options, he slams into the windshield of one of the cars, completely shattering the glass. Yet, despite this brutal impact, Huggy is completely unharmed. The employees respond by using tranquilizer guns against him, just like they did with Catnap when he escaped confinement and went on a killing spree, but there's one key difference. For Catnap, the tranquilizers actually worked, subduing him successfully. For Huggy, not even close. After being hit, Huggy ran off into the woods, continuing to casually murder any workers who were sent after him. At one point, he even devoured a deer. The fact that Huggy was able to remain fully active, even after being physically assaulted and hit with tranquilizers, proves just how strong and resilient he really is, even if the retrieval team were able to capture him later on. But in all fairness, Huggy was clearly in a docile state at this time, and Huggy would have inevitably gotten the upper hand once again if he decided to fight back at this moment. With all this being said though, we do need to acknowledge that the tranquilizer dart would have still harmed Huggy to some extent. After all, he is an organic creature, just like his fellow bigger body experiments, and we've already seen clear proof that these experiments aren't invincible. Mommy Longlegs, Miss Delight, Catnap, Doey the Doorman, all of them are presumed to be dead. Sure, some of these toys might return in the future, possibly as part of the prototype, but the important thing is that they can still be killed. That makes sense, considering that they all have biological components that can be fatally damaged. In the aftermath of Huggy's great fall, his blood was left on the pipes he collided with, proving that he can bleed. His mouth had visible plates, a clear sign of organic structure.
Avoiding a collapsing catwalk that sent our dear Huggy plummeting into the depths below.
And a particularly graphic frame from the Doctor's cinematic trailer also shows actual guts inside Huggy's body. Now, speaking of the Doctor, he actually provided us with some very interesting clues during Chapter 4's ARG, clues that might explain why Huggy, despite being organic as we've just established, might not be a mortal creature. In one of the Doctor's many thoughts revealed in the ARG's maze section, he randomly brings up Huggy's experiment number 1170 completely out of the blue with no context or explanation. But what if there was a reason for this? Well, before this, fans had actually managed to contact the Doctor directly through a Playtime IT email. One of them asked about Huggy Wuggy's fate, and how did the Doctor respond? By accidentally getting Huggy's experiment number wrong and typing out what seemed like a nonsensical response. At least that's how it may seem until we take a closer look at two very specific words in his message: will restore. The Doctor was literally the man behind the experiments, so of course he would know all about them. Plus, wouldn't it make perfect sense for a creature whose primary job involves murder to be equipped with a natural restoration ability in case they were ever ever to get hurt themselves? The cherry on top here is that the doctor couldn't have been talking about Huggy's recovery after his fall. The ARG and, by extension, the emails all took place in 2002, a full 3 years before the events of the game. This information may explain how Huggy survived and why the prototype chose to repair him instead of just using his body for parts. Although there is a crucial factor we need to consider. If you recall, Experiment 1160 Boxy Boo was the first bigger body.
The first of many, naturally. You have proven my bigger body's initiative a success.
The doctor noted in Boxy Boo's experiment report that improvements could still be made to the bigger body procedures. Since Huggy Wuggy is Experiment 1170, meaning he was the 11th bigger body, it's clear that by the time of his creation, the scientists were still refining the process, learning more each day about how to make these experiments more advanced and efficient. So the fact that Huggy, one of the earliest bigger body experiments, was able to be made with a restoration ability was a huge breakthrough in itself. But of course, it's highly unlikely that this ability was flawless. This means Huggy may have still needed help after his plummet. The most likely scenario? After falling, Huggy managed to make his way to the water treatment facility. This is backed up by the fact that blood stains and patches of blue fur were found on the walls in that area. However, it's possible that this was where he could no longer keep going, at least not until the prototype emerged with an opportunity. He could repair Huggy, but only under one condition. In return, Huggy would once again track down the player, only this time he would make sure the job was finished for good. For the prototype, this meant his plans could move forward. For Huggy, this meant he could finally get his sweet revenge. But this raises an important question. How do we know that the prototype was the one who fixed Huggy? Well, it turns out we don't even need to dig deep to figure this out. The CEO of Mob Entertainment accidentally confirmed it in a now-deleted Discord message where he compared Poppy Playtime characters to Star Wars characters. Now, if we're assuming that after a severe injury, like, say, falling from an absurd height, Huggy's restoration ability only works for a limited time before he inevitably succumbs to his wounds, then that just leaves us with one big mystery. What does this all mean for Chapter 5? Can we truly stop Huggy if the prototype is always lurking in the shadows, just waiting to repair him when his situation gets too dire? Well, our entire mission in Chapter 5 is literally to kill the prototype. Perhaps we'll succeed, only for a shocking plot twist to reveal that Huggy Wuggy is actually the true final boss. That would be very fitting, considering that he was our very first antagonist back in Chapter 1. To finally defeat him, we'd need to get him to an irreversibly fragile state, one where his restoration ability is completely useless, and then, at long last, finish Huggy off once and for all. But if that doesn't go to plan, then we might only have one hope left.
I know there's not really another option. The toys will starve otherwise. They'll die.
The bigger body experiments, including Huggy Wuggy, require sustenance to survive, so maybe if we can avoid Huggy long enough in Chapter 5, he'll eventually starve to death. Though, let's be honest, that's highly unlikely. The previously mentioned strategy of completely destroying his ability to restore himself is definitely the more plausible approach. Regardless, one thing is certain, even if we can defeat Huggy, it will be no easy task. Was the doctor actually trying to take us down? At first glance, the answer may seem obvious. After all, he's set up countless traps in our path, but what if I told you there's a significant amount of evidence which suggests the opposite of what we've been led to believe? After carefully placing together these clues, I've come to some theories that may reveal how the Doctor was never truly an antagonist to begin with. First, let's acknowledge the obvious. Throughout Chapter 4, the Doctor numerously attempted to eliminate us, whether it be by unleashing a bunch of nightmare critters, setting Yarnaby loose to hunt us down, freezing the entire room, or dispatching an army of robots in our direction. It appears undeniable that he wanted us gone. However, there's something peculiar about the way death functions in this game. Each time the player dies, they mysteriously return, guided by an unknown entity that telepathically urges them to rise again. This could very well be Poppy, considering she has a vested interest in keeping us alive for her own plans. This suggests that our ability to respawn is not just a gameplay feature, but an intentional part of the storyline, possibly linked to the life-preserving properties of Poppy's flowers, which are hinted at in a report from Chapter 2. If these respawns are indeed part of the canon, then maybe the Doctor knew that even if he managed to kill us, we would inevitably return. But this raises an important question. Why bother setting up all the traps in the first place? One possibility is that he simply found it entertaining. If you recall, he isolated Yarnaby, depriving him of any social interaction purely for his amusement, even commenting on how he found Yarnaby's distress noises hilarious. It's evident that the Doctor takes pleasure in the suffering of others. This is especially clear in the way he interacts with us throughout Chapter 4.
The subject scrambles for an advantage. They appear lost and disoriented. Heavy breathing is indicative of fear, and rightly so.
But what if there's another explanation? If the Doctor's traps were meant purely for his own enjoyment and our deaths were actually permanent, then why did he never attack us directly? Aside from a brief moment where he threw us down a staircase, he never physically confronted us, which is odd, especially since doing so would surely be more amusing for him. Instead, he only communicated through speakers and relied on his minions to do the dirty work. We know he has a physical form based on promotional trailers, so why did he avoid direct confrontation? Could it be that he never truly wanted us dead? According to the Story So Far videos on Mob Entertainment's YouTube, the Doctor had been observing our journey through the factory ever since the beginning. Funny how he started as a scientist and then became some insane stalker. He had witnessed us survive many encounters with deadly experiments and just the general deadly layout of the factory, so there's no reason to believe the Doctor thought his traps would succeed in taking us down when no one or nothing else could, unless you want to argue that he was blinded by his ego, I suppose.
You think you can do better? Nobody else can do what I do. You need my knowledge, my intellect.
Given this, it seems increasingly plausible that the Doctor never actually intended to kill us. If anything, he might have been hoping we would end his own suffering after being trapped in Playtime Co. alone for a whole decade. But there's an even stronger theory that could explain everything, so let's take a fresh look. One major discussion point following Chapter 4 was Doey the Doorman's claim that the Doctor and the Prototype were working together. Logically, this doesn't make much sense. The Prototype should despise the Doctor for initiating the Bigger Bodies initiative. This conflict is even hinted at in a VHS tape.
You stick us,
Beat us.
tear at flesh.
Furthermore, most evidence suggests that the Prototype orchestrated the Hour of Joy to put an end to the experimentation that was happening. However, Chapter 4 sheds more light on this seemingly bizarre alliance. A VHS tape reveals that there was never an actual partnership between the Doctor and the Prototype. The Prototype was merely keeping the Doctor alive for his knowledge.
Your suggestions?
To produce the results
I'm after. Have I made an error in allowing your survival?
From this, we can infer that the Doctor, like many of the toy monsters we encountered, was operating under the Prototype's command. Now, the Prototype may have been keeping us alive for a very specific reason: our ability to eliminate experiments, allowing him to harvest their remains for whatever twisted project he's working on, which is likely adding them to his own body to become the ultimate experiment. With a supply of corpses now at his disposal, the Prototype likely no longer sees a need for us, which is probably why he was following us during Chapter 4. To get rid of us. He may have even coerced the Doctor into setting up the traps, using him as his pawn. This wouldn't be the first time the Prototype manipulated others into doing his work either, because I don't know about you, but I never saw him participating in the Hour of Joy. Not to mention that he had an orphan named Theodore Graham Bell steal loads of company supplies just so they could escape the building. Granted, this idea of the Prototype being the reason for the Doctor's traps does contradict an earlier theory that the Doctor no longer saw a reason for survival. If he had, he wouldn't have followed the Prototype's orders, and instead just accepted his demise. But there's one major reason he might have still been clinging to life, which is a discovery that has been referenced throughout some previous ARGs and was explicitly mentioned by the Doctor in this newest chapter.
My discovery, my recognition. I was the one who paved the golden path.
So, if the Doctor's traps weren't motivated by personal hatred, this could mean he didn't actually dislike us at all. Not once is his true motive for wanting us dead actually revealed in the game, and another noteworthy detail is that he shares valuable story information with us, something he wouldn't bother doing if he truly planned on killing us soon afterward. That said, he does make some demotivating remarks toward the player.
You realize the futility of this, don't you? Meat rots and loses its function. It's as replaceable as anything else. You're accomplishing nothing.
However, given that he's seen us overcome every challenge thrown our way, he likely recognizes our determination. His discouraging words may actually be a form of reverse psychology, an attempt to fuel our drive to press forward. This still leaves us one lingering question though: why would he want us to complete our mission? Well, the Doctor is one of the most self-centered figures in the franchise. He likely can't stand being ordered around, even by the Prototype, an experiment he once took great interest in. And despite his proposal of the Bigger Bodies initiative to apparently save the company, he probably hated Playtime Co. by the time of the game's events, considering they betrayed him and turned him into a cyborg, even if it was for a valid reason.
When I get my hands on you, you're a dead man!
And of course, we can't forget how heartbroken he felt upon getting kicked out of the Young Geniuses program by company founder Elliot Ludwig all those years ago. Knowing that our goal is to destroy the Prototype along with the factory, the Doctor may have secretly wanted us to succeed in this goal, finally bringing down Ludwig's empire as sweet revenge and getting rid of the experiment that he was stuck under the command of, allowing him the freedom to resume his studies and achieve what he calls the Golden Path, which I believe is immortality.
Mortality is the curse of the weak. The fire that incinerates the flesh. I strive to...
What's the real connection between Poppy and the Prototype? There's clearly more going on between these two than what's immediately obvious. After carefully analyzing clues throughout the game, I've pieced together some strong theories that could unravel this mystery and possibly reveal what it means for the future of Poppy Playtime. Near the end of Chapter 4, we overhear Poppy and the Prototype speaking over the phone. However, their conversation is riddled with cryptic language, making it difficult to decipher their true intentions.
You don't need to play at being stronger than you are. You can come home.
How much do you know?
Everything.
To better understand what they're saying, we first need to examine the connection between Ollie and Poppy, as it serves a crucial piece of the puzzle. Based on Poppy's words, Ollie had been her friend for many years.
Here, Poppy. For you, I'll always be here.
Ollie also acted as a guide throughout most of Chapter 3 and some parts of the latest chapter. However, a Chapter 3 VHS tape revealed one of the Prototype's key abilities, mimicking voices. This served as a foreshadowing as to when we eventually learnt that Poppy's longtime friend was actually the very entity she despised and sought to destroy.
The charade is over.
Who is this?
An obvious question with an obvious answer.
You. What did you do with Ollie?
This leads to an important question. Why did the Prototype go through such lengths to deceive Poppy for so long? Well, let's recall that the Prototype locked Poppy away in her case immediately after the Hour of Joy, likely as a result of her refusal to support the massacre he orchestrated to avenge the mistreated orphans. She remained imprisoned for a long time, at least until we eventually freed her, so perhaps the Prototype had already been impersonating Ollie before her imprisonment, subtly manipulating her into believing that the Hour of Joy was justified. In fact, there's concrete proof that Poppy was aware of the event before it even happened.
Did she tell you her part of the Hour of Joy? That she knew it was coming? Or did she leave out that crucial detail?
By 2005, when the events of the game take place and Poppy is freed, there was no longer a reason for the Prototype to maintain the facade, which explains why he finally revealed his true identity. Now, one could argue that if this theory holds true, why didn't Poppy resent Ollie for believing in the Hour of Joy? Well, in all fairness, there's a key distinction between supporting something and actively making it happen. Poppy may not have severed ties with Ollie just for seeing the event in a positive light, as even with all the negative parts of it, the massacre still did bring justice to the orphans who had suffered under the hands of Playtime. Now, a major theory tied to this mystery is that the prototype is actually Elliot Ludwig, the company's founder. This idea has been proposed many times before, but there are certain clues to it that have been very overlooked. To begin with, Ludwig being the prototype aligns with the timeline. We know that the Bigger Bodies initiative began in 1990 after Dr. Harley Sawyer was recruited to Playtime Co. through an initiative from Leith Pierre, who referred to himself as the head of the factory in the letter. This implies that Ludwig was already dead by that point. Yes, there's an image in his office featuring Mommy Longlegs, a 1991 toy, but this doesn't seem to be canon since it originated from a fan art contest in real life. More importantly, the prototype is not a bigger body experiment, as he existed before the initiative began. A Chapter 3 ARG document references an incident from 1989 involving an orphan named Theodore Graham Bell, in which the prototype played a significant role. This means that the prototype was the original of something other than the Bigger Bodies initiative. I'll further clarify what that something was later on. To put it simply, the prototype existed by 1989 and Ludwig was gone by 1990, meaning he could have been transformed into the prototype. A Chapter 4 VHS tape even confirms a connection between Ludwig and Poppy.
I wish you were here, Dad. I could really use one of your talks right about now. You'd know what to say. When you were running this place, you always knew what to say.
If the prototype is Ludwig, it would technically mean that he is Poppy's father, something she may not even realize, but then why would he want to lock his own daughter in a case she clearly hates? Well, the answer to this lies in one of the trailers for the spin-off game Project Playtime. Just take a listen to what Ollie, aka the prototype, says in this trailer.
Compassion is the discarded gem of the Forsaken.
The prototype exhibits no compassion for any living being except the orphans. That's likely because he personally related to their suffering, having been experimented on himself. His lack of empathy even explains why he orchestrated the Hour of Joy despite knowing it would claim so many innocent lives. And if all of this is true, it would clarify what the prototype really meant by saying everything is about him and Poppy, the company's founder and his daughter. However, despite all this evidence, I still don't believe this is what's actually going on here. The prototype clearly wants Poppy locked away due to their ideological differences, but there's a significant amount of evidence suggesting that Ludwig was actually a good man who genuinely wanted to help people. I mean, there are even characters in the story who emphasize this point.
When my people were building Playcare, all Mr. Ludwig could talk about was how much good it could do. And all you needed was a look at the man to know he believed every word of it.
And let's not ignore how suspicious it is that Ludwig just so happened to have already been dead shortly before the Bigger Bodies initiative began, not to mention the strong implication from Chapter 4's ARG that Ludwig was murdered. So, under the assumption that Ludwig was a good guy, it's highly unlikely that he is the true identity of the prototype. In fact, I don't think solving his identity is even necessary to understand this particular mystery. It all comes down to how unique both he and Poppy are. Consider why the prototype is called the prototype. He must have been the first of something. Since we established that he wasn't part of the Bigger Bodies initiative, he must have been the initial creation of an entirely separate scientific field, which was also referenced in the most recent ARG. Additional evidence also supports this. The prototype is Experiment 1006, and just 9 subjects later, the scientists created Experiment 1015. Their report on 1015 mentions they were working with a brand new scientific field. Likewise, there is substantial evidence suggesting that Poppy was also some form of an original.
In the 1960s, an unfortunate family death had pushed Ludwig down to his lowest.
Ludwig had a daughter, and this family death likely refers to her. That would explain the origin of the living Poppy doll, who was likely created in the 1960s, long before the prototype or any similar experiments. Additionally, a very old-looking maintenance video shows surgery being performed on Poppy, further indicating that she was the first human-based experiment in Playtime Co. history. The prototype, on the other hand, was the very first of a new scientific field that eventually led to the creation of living toy experiments. Each of them is unique in their own right, which is why the prototype believes that everything revolves around them. Interestingly, they also share certain traits. We learned in Chapter 1's trailer that the prototype does not require food to survive, unlike other experiments. It's safe to assume Poppy possesses this same ability as well, just considering how she survived all those years trapped in her case. And what do you know, she's still alive and well. Or, if you want to consider her well at least.
I can't go back in the case. I can't.
Both characters also exhibit selfish tendencies. Poppy kept us trapped in the factory to fulfill her own goals, while the prototype mercilessly killed his most loyal follower, Catnap, simply for failing to eliminate us. If I had to guess, the prototype wants Poppy locked away not only because they disagree on certain things, but also to ensure that he remains the only special one. He wants the spotlight all to himself, a motivation that aligns with the selfish nature he's displayed up until this point. Is the prototype actually able to bring dead toys back to life? It's an interesting question, one that might explain how past antagonists who were seemingly defeated could return in the future. After hours of digging through the many clues revealed in Chapter 4, I believe I've found the answer to this mystery. Let's go over all the evidence that supports this theory while also considering any details that might contradict the idea that the prototype can bring others back to life. By doing this, we can form a more complete conclusion. After that, we'll explore why the prototype would even be interested in resurrecting these toys in the first place. First, it's important to recognize that the prototype is a super intelligent entity, something the game has proven multiple times. However, intelligence alone isn't enough to confirm this theory. That said, a newly discovered VHS tape in Chapter 4, which takes place sometime after the Hour of Joy, might hold some key answers. This tape reveals that the prototype kept the Doctor alive purely for his knowledge that could help with a mysterious project the prototype was working on.
I'm still your best shot at cracking that secret. If I weren't, you would have already killed me.
Now, one possibility is that this project is directly linked to the various toys we've encountered and ultimately defeated during our time in Playtime Co.
What have you done? You make me part of him!
If you didn't catch it, Mommy Longlegs ominously mentions that she'll become part of him right before the prototype drags away her remains, the same fate of Catnap in Chapter 3. Additionally, there's Catnap's eerie shrine, which appears to be a makeshift statue of the prototype and is covered in parts of deceased toys. All of this strongly suggests that the prototype is using these remains to add on to himself, possibly growing stronger by assimilating different pieces. So the Chapter 4 VHS tape may actually tie into this process. However, there's another angle we need to consider. Before the Doctor was turned into an experiment himself, he was the one responsible for creating these experiments, these giant toys we've encountered. And when we take a closer look at his ultimate goals, his true intentions start to become much clearer.
Mortality is the curse of the weak.
Given that the Doctor was a scientist dedicated to uncovering the secrets of eternal life, it would make perfect sense for the prototype's mysterious project to be focused on reviving dead toys, given he was relying on the Doctor's knowledge to achieve it. However, there's still no clear confirmation that the prototype was ever successful in bringing his project to fruition anyway, meaning we need to dig deeper for more clues. One key piece of evidence can be found in Elliot Ludwig's office during Chapter 2. A note there mentions that poppy flowers may possess what he describes as life-altering properties. Ludwig even went so far as to create a gel from these flowers and tested it in an experiment to see if it could revive a dead rat. The experiment ultimately failed, but the mere fact that the game presents this idea of poppies having special properties seems intentional, like it's hinting at something bigger. This concept aligns with another important detail, the red smoke that filled the playcare every night, which the orphans inhaled to fall asleep before undergoing their transformation into toys. Given its color, this gas was likely created from poppy flowers, possibly playing a crucial role in the experimentation process. And there's yet another significant connection. At the end of Chapter 4, we pass through an area full to the brim of poppies. And where exactly is this field of flowers located? Right outside the entrance to the lab, the very place that the prototype apparently lives.
They're below, in the labs. The prototype's home. They are alive, but sleeping.
If poppy flowers were ultimately proven by Ludwig or the scientists to play a role in reviving the dead, then it would make perfect sense to store a supply of them right outside the experimentation area. This would allow easy access for any future attempts at resurrection, and with these flowers now at the prototype's disposal, it's entirely possible that he's using them in some way to bring the experiments back to life. A prime example of this could be Huggy Wuggy, who, as we learn at the end of Chapter 4, is still alive. If the prototype possesses knowledge or control over the revival process, he likely knew this all along. In fact, he didn't even seem remotely fazed when Poppy attempted to intimidate him by claiming that all of his disciples were dead, suggesting that he was aware it wasn't the case with Huggy.
The doctor, Catnap, Mommy and Huggy, they're all dead. You have nothing now. No one. And soon, you'll have less than that.
Stop that.
You don't need to pretend anymore.
Poppy. You don't need to play at being stronger than you are.
You can
come home.
Now, realistically speaking, it's highly unlikely that any mortal being, such as Huggy, could have survived a massive fall on his own, and that's exactly why I believe he didn't. A Discord message from the CEO of Mob Entertainment had him comparing the prototype to Palpatine, the infamous Star Wars character who, in that series, rebuilt Darth Vader, who, in that same message, was also compared to Huggy. With this information in mind, it becomes clear why the message was deleted almost immediately. However, while this is compelling evidence, it isn't quite strong enough on its own to definitively prove that the prototype has the ability to revive toys, since there is an important distinction between repairing and resurrecting. Perhaps Huggy barely managed to cling to life after his brutal fall, only to be discovered by the prototype, who then patched him up using bandages and other means to ensure his survival. On top of that, the most recent ARG hinted at another possibility. In the email by the doctor, it was implied that Huggy was created with some sort of natural ability to restore himself if he were ever injured. Now, while the doctor mistakenly refers to Huggy's experiment number as 1070 instead of 1170, it's clearly just a typo, as the question he was responding to directly referenced Huggy by name. This self-repairing trait may even be linked to Huggy's remarkable physical strength, something that was detailed in the orientation notebook. But regardless of whether Huggy was revived or merely repaired, one thing is certain: the prototype played a key role in his survival. Otherwise, that deleted Discord message means nothing. To top it all off, there's one final clue that strongly suggests the prototype might actually have the ability to bring dead toys back to life. Earlier we discussed the theory that he could be collecting toy corpses to add their parts to his own form, but what if that's not the case? To answer this, we need to analyze the prototype's personality. It's been stated that he orchestrated a massacre of all the Playtime Co. employees in an attempt to put an end to the experimentation, but while this might appear to be true, when looking into it deeper, it becomes apparent that the prototype probably doesn't care about the toys at all.
Prototype says we can't leave. Not now, not ever.
Not to mention, the prototype is actively letting the toys starve, and even went as far as to murder one of his most loyal followers, Catnap. Beneath his facade, it's clear he doesn't actually care about anyone. Sure, there was a time when he seemed capable of compassion, like when he sacrificed his own freedom to save orphan Theodore Grambell's life in 1989, but that was 16 years before the events of the game. By now, any trace of empathy appears to be long gone. Honestly, I wouldn't even be surprised if he orchestrated the Hour of Joy purely as a means to put an end to his own suffering, so that he could escape the endless cycle of experimentation once and for all. So, where am I going with all this? Well, according to Poppy, the orphans did survive and are now living inside the labs with the prototype. She also mentions that they're sleeping, which could very well mean that he's forcing them to inhale red smoke, just like when the factory was still operational, and much like the scientists before him, the prototype may now be using these children as test subjects, harvesting their organs to revive the dead experiments. Perhaps this is what the Doctor is being kept alive for, though that part remains speculative. If the prototype is performing these experiments, his end goal might not be simple resurrection, but control. By reviving these dead toys with fresh, newly transplanted organs, their minds could be left in a state where they initially contain no negative thoughts about the prototype. If they were to forget that he turned them into these toys, that is, and we have seen experiments such as Brontoy made from employee Thomas Clark suffer from similar memory loss, so with these toys having near blank memories, it would be easy for him to manipulate them into following only him. After all, it's already clear that not all the toys before this were blindly loyal to him.
We tried to fight it. The prototype's control. I am the last.
Taking all this evidence into account, it seems highly likely that the prototype does, in some capacity, have the ability to revive dead toys. Now, if the theory we just explored isn't the actual explanation, then there's another possibility, one that paints the prototype in a slightly different light. What if, deep down, he does care about the orphans and can't bear to watch them be slaughtered in their toy bodies? If that's the case, then his act of resurrecting them might not be about manipulation or control, it could simply be his way of protecting them, ensuring they aren't lost forever. In fact, this could even explain why the prototype wants us dead so badly. Maybe, from his perspective, we're the real monster, the one responsible for wiping out the very children he's been trying to save. If that's true, then his relentless pursuit of us isn't just about power or revenge, it's about justice for all the lives we've taken. The Smiling Critters, the main characters of Chapter 3, are widely assumed to be gone for good, but what if that's not the case? I know it sounds far-fetched, but Chapter 4 has introduced several new clues that, when pieced together with past lore, hint at a much deeper mystery, one that might just explain how the Smiling Critters could make an unexpected return in Chapter 5. Now, we obviously can't ignore Dog Day's words.
I am the last of the Smiling Critters.
However, there might be more to the story than it seems. The orientation notebook implies that there could be multiple bigger body versions of each Smiling Critter, so let's analyze each one of them using all the available info, including their cardboard cutouts. These cutouts might be indirectly revealing past events in the factory, or simply hinting at hidden truths. If that's the case, then Bubba Bubbaphant might have already died since he screams loudly at the end of his cutout, but I don't actually believe this to be the case, because his scream only happens after he asks if we want to know what he remembers about us. This could indicate that Bubba's cutout and its scream are solely meant to hint at the darker past of our player character when they worked at the factory, which does align with the feelings of guilt they're implied to have. That said, it's unlikely our character was a scientist, or the Doctor would have surely remembered us in Chapter 4, and yet he didn't. So, all in all, there's no solid proof that Bubba is gone for good. Besides, elephants are incredibly strong anyway, so Bubba could probably fight off any enemies. However, I can't say the same about Kickin' Chicken. His cutout showcases the moment he stepped outside for the first time, and, as you'd expect, it doesn't end well for him. If you recall, another one of his cutouts appeared in the safe haven during Chapter 4, almost as if its inhabitants wanted to remember him that way. To me, this and the content of the cutout itself makes it clear that Kickin' Chicken is a goner, and even if there are multiple of him, they would likely have the characteristics of an actual chicken, meaning self-defense would not be one of their skills. But the same might not be true for who's featured next on the critter cutout, Catnap. His cutout only features disturbing groaning noises, which doesn't tell us much. Let's analyze his supposed death scene instead. A popular theory suggests that his death was just a hallucination caused by the red smoke. However, this theory is disproved since how would the green hand we used to ignite him permanently detach from our grab pack afterward if the event never actually occurred? Catnap is well and truly dead, unless we consider another angle. Catnap's entire death sequence seems to mirror the near-fatal injury of Theodore Graham Bell, the orphan who was transformed into Catnap. An ARG revealed that Theodore and the prototype teamed up to escape plague care, but due to Theodore's lack of knowledge, he ended up getting electrocuted by an overcharged green grab pack hand. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The key element here is that the prototype took Theodore to safety, saving his life in the long run. What if the same thing is happening now? The prototype may have only killed Catnap to put him out of his misery after being burnt alive, only to repair and enhance him, making him stronger than before. Given the theory that the prototype also may have been the one who fixed up Huggy Wuggy, it wouldn't be surprising if he did the same for his most loyal follower. Plus, bringing back Catnap would obviously be good fan service considering his popularity. Next up is Picky Piggy, who most definitely is a trustworthy friend.
Still hungry. Hey, what do you say you and I be friends?
Interestingly, she mentions eating beef, chicken, elephant, and unicorn, most of which correspond to the animals that make up some of her fellow smiling critters. This doesn't change anything regarding Kickin' Chicken since we already established he's dead, but it does imply that at least one bigger body version of Bubba Bubbaphant and Crafty Corn was devoured by Picky Piggy. This significantly lowers their chances of returning in the future. However, Picky Piggy herself seems very capable of self-defense, otherwise she would have been killed trying to eat the wrong target. So I'd say there's a good chance she'll show up again in a bigger body form sooner or later. The next cutout belongs to Hoppy Hopscotch, and I believe her audio hints at a dark and tragic story. She tries to hop all the way to the moon multiple times, which could metaphorically represent her repeated attempts to escape play care after the hour of joy.
Again! 1, 2, 3! Nope. Still didn't make it.
After many failed attempts, she finally gets a different result, but not the one she was hoping for.
Jump! Jump!
This could be the moment when Hoppy hopped her final hop, plummeting from the catwalks and the graves, meeting a gruesome end. Her cutout placement between Playcare, where she was trying to escape from, and the caves where she seemingly perished supports this theory even more. However, there may have been another bigger body version of Hoppy, possibly the one who was living at the safe haven as revealed in a Chapter 4 VHS tape.
Look at me! I'm a mess!
Poppy, what's going on?
We were trying to bring supplies back up to the elevator, but we got jumped.
Despite this, I don't believe we'll see a bigger body Hoppy Hopscotch in the game. The one on the tape is missing when we arrive at Safe Haven, suggesting she's already dead. Bobby Bearhug is next, and by the sound of it, she was abandoned by the other smiling critters, perhaps during their rebellion against the prototype. However, her cutout doesn't end with a scream, meaning she might still be alive. Additionally, she talks about her abandonment as if it's something that already happened, which, if true, would mean she survived it.
Please, take me with you this time.
Interestingly, there was a statue of Bobby in the orphanage during Chapter 3, and which smiling critter bigger body do we find a report of in the orientation notebook? None other than Bobby Bearhugs. These could very well be hints of her appearing in the future, possibly as an ally given her love-centered personality, although it would have made more sense for Bobby to show up in Chapter 4 if they were indeed hints to her appearance. But then again, they could have just acted as very early foreshadowings. Unlike Bobby, Dog Day does scream in his cutout, and for an extended period of time, possibly mimicking the moment Catnap tore his legs off. However, we never saw his big body form get killed, though it is likely he was eaten off screen by the mini critters that used his body as a suit to hunt us down. So I believe the only way he could return is if a separate bigger body Dog Day exists, potentially one who wants to avenge the Dog Day from Chapter 3, but there's little evidence for that, meaning the chances of it are pretty low. Finally, Crafty Corn's cutout suggests she isn't as innocent as she seems. She first asks for blue paint, then red, but her reaction upon learning the red paint has all been used up shows Crafty's true colors.
You're hiding more red from me. I know you are. Give it here!
The red paint likely symbolizes blood, implying Crafty Corn is a predator experiment who kills vulnerable toys that she can feast on for survival. This suggests she's strong enough to have survived up until now, but not when considering Picky Piggy's lines, as it's implied that Crafty Corn was one of her victims. Do keep in mind, though, that there could be another big body Crafty Corn who is still alive and could show up going forward. To recap, the smiling critters most likely to make a future appearance are Bubba Bubbaphant, Catnap, Picky Piggy, Bobby Bearhug, and Crafty Corn. Some may be allies, while others will likely be enemies in Chapter 5. What if I told you that Poppy and the prototype aren't just significant on their own, but actually related? It might sound crazy, but if this is true, it wouldn't just clear up some of the game's biggest mysteries, it could completely change how we understand both of these characters. Their connection might hold the key to the prototype's real motives, Poppy's true purpose, and what's coming in Chapter 5. To get to the bottom of this, we need to start at the beginning by looking at what makes Poppy so different from everything else Playtime Co. ever created. Because, right away, one thing is obvious, Poppy isn't just another experiment. She stands apart from all the rest, and there's one major reason why. She's the daughter of the company's founder, Elliot Ludwig.
I wish you were here, Dad. I could really use one of your talks right about now. You'd know what to say. When you were running this place, you always knew what to say.
By the time the Bigger Bodies initiative had started, Elliot Ludwig was already dead. We know this because Leith Pierre had taken over as Playtime Co.'s CEO by early 1990, as confirmed by his invitation letter to Harley Sawyer. Now, while there is a picture in Ludwig's office featuring the 1991 toy Mommy Longlegs, we can safely dismiss this as non-canon since it originated from a fan art contest. This means that Poppy must have been created long before the rest of the living toys, proving just how different she truly is. Unlike the Bigger Body experiments, which were designed by scientists who started out in the Young Geniuses program, Poppy was personally created by Ludwig himself. And clearly, his methods were very different. Poppy was able to survive sealed in her case for an entire decade without food or sustenance. Meanwhile, the Bigger Body toys require constant nourishment to stay alive. But there's even more to uncover. Thanks to some key evidence found in Chapter 2, we may actually be able to pinpoint when Poppy was created.
In the 1960s, an unfortunate family death had pushed Ludwig down to his lowest.
This loved one must have been Ludwig's daughter, especially considering how Poppy's maintenance video was clearly recorded around this same time period. This would even explain how Ludwig carried on with his work at the factory so casually, despite going through such a devastating loss, because he brought his daughter back to life by transforming her into the Poppy doll. Unless this family death wasn't a tragedy to Ludwig at all. In Chapter 2, there's a note found in Ludwig's office documenting Experiment 814. The fact that it's located here strongly suggests that he himself wrote it. Even more suspiciously, the note is placed right next to the VHS tape talking about the family death. The document details an experiment where a dead rat was used in a revival attempt, which ultimately failed, but what's even more disturbing is how the note ends. Ludwig concludes by stating that a larger test subject might yield different results. This heavily implies that Ludwig may have killed his own family member, probably his own daughter, all in the name of science. His supposed grief could have been nothing more than a carefully staged act for the press. If this theory holds true, then Ludwig may have been fully willing to not only potentially sacrifice his daughter's life, but also many others. The orientation notebook makes it abundantly clear that most, if not all, the Poppy dolls sold in the public in 1950 were living creatures, as if that wasn't already obvious from the start.
Is there anything else you'd like to say, Poppy?
I'm a real girl, just like you.
This meant that Ludwig already had experience in creating living toys before reviving his daughter in the form of one, ones that, just like her, didn't need to eat. After all, it's not like kids would have been physically feeding their Poppy Playtime dolls. So, where does the prototype fit into all of this? Well, believe it or not, just like Poppy, he also wasn't an official Bigger Body experiment. A document about catnap found in the Chapter 3 ARG confirms that the prototype already existed by 1989, which was before the Bigger Bodies initiative was introduced. And that strikes us as strange, considering his name is literally prototype, suggesting he was the first of something, and he most certainly was, just not the first Bigger Body. That title belongs to Boxy Boo. Instead, the prototype was the first experiment of an entirely different field, one that was briefly referenced in Chapter 4's ARG, though we still don't know much about it. But here's where things get really interesting. Despite being so different, the prototype and Poppy share a major similarity. Just like Poppy, he doesn't need food, a fact revealed in the Chapter 1 trailer. And no, this isn't because he's a robot. In fact, we know for certain that the prototype is biological since that same trailer explicitly states that he has a digestive tract. And another major connection between the two? They both seem to care about the orphans. The prototype sacrificed his freedom to save orphan Theodore Graham Bell after his electrocution incident. He also made sure the other orphans weren't killed during the Hour of Joy, taking them to safety in the labs where he still resides. At least that's according to Poppy, and wouldn't you know it, her master plan just so happens to involve ensuring the orphans' safety before blowing up the factory, but it probably won't be that simple. Because if the orphans are under the prototype's care, then it seems like he doesn't want anyone getting near them.
That will give me labs access. At least with the two of us.
That is out of the question.
You will support.
Despite their similarities, Poppy and the prototype are still enemies. The prototype locked Poppy in a case for years solely for her disagreement with the Hour of Joy. While that event may have had some positive outcomes, it also came at the cost of countless innocent lives, and for that, Poppy wants nothing more than to see the prototype dead. But despite their opposition, the fact that these two characters are so special still feels significant. Now, one of the most popular theories suggests that the prototype is actually Elliot Ludwig himself. It makes some sense from a timeline perspective and would explain why he orchestrated the Hour of Joy, if, of course, his true goal was to put an end to the experimentation, but we already established that Ludwig wasn't truly against the experiments, at least not until the Young Geniuses program came into being, since Ludwig seemed to have learned from his mistakes by this time, but even then it's impossible to be sure. Hundreds of Poppy dolls contained human organs, and Ludwig was very much alive during that time, meaning he obviously approved of it. This is why I don't believe that Ludwig is the prototype, especially when you consider that Poppy herself would likely know the truth, and she never acknowledges the prototype as her father. Instead, I believe Ludwig created the prototype just like he did with Poppy, and suddenly, everything clicks into place. This is why neither of them need food to survive, and it would explain why the scientists struggled so much to perfect the bigger body procedures after Ludwig was gone. They were so desperate to figure it out that they even physically dissected Poppy, trying to reverse engineer whatever Ludwig had done to create her.
It's been weeks and weeks of taking things out and putting them back in and taking things out and putting them back in.
This could even give us more insight into why Sawyer held such a deep grudge against Ludwig. We already know that he felt heartbroken and betrayed after being removed from the Young Geniuses program, going so far as to label Ludwig a backstabber. But what if jealousy eventually started playing a role in this hatred as well? Maybe Sawyer wasn't just angry at Ludwig for betraying him. Maybe he resented the fact that Ludwig had already perfected the process of creating flawless living toys, while he had to spend so long studying just to figure it out himself. And in his obsession with uncovering the truth, Sawyer even resorted to torturing the prototype.
There's a secret inside you, 1006. Valuable beyond all measure. I cut and prod and burn at it.
What if Poppy and the prototype's connection runs even deeper though? We know that Poppy is Ludwig's daughter, but what if the prototype is Ludwig's son? At first, this might sound far-fetched, but when we examine a few key pieces of evidence, it starts to make a lot more sense. However, before diving into those, it's worth debunking a popular theory, that the prototype is actually Rich, one of Playtime Co.'s employees. A Chapter 4 tape features a worker talking to Rich about a recent incident where his co-worker mentioned him disappearing. We know that employees only started vanishing mysteriously after the Bigger Bodies initiative was well underway, thus after the prototype's creation. By that point, anyone who accidentally discovered the initiative without clearance would be eliminated, with Boxy Boo making a meal out of them. Rowan Stoll was the first example of this happening. Since Rich was still alive and well after these disappearances began, it's clear that he is not the prototype's true identity. So what's the evidence that Ludwig's son is behind said identity? For starters, Ludwig would have been an old man by the time the prototype was created, meaning his son would likely have been a fully grown adult. And the prototype's intelligence suggests that his test subject was a mature individual rather than a child. Now, if Poppy had any siblings in her human life, it's reasonable to assume that Ludwig, being a family man at heart as described in his biography, would want to reunite them by turning both of them into living experiments. Of course, this could explain some of the prototype's cryptic lines near Chapter 4's conclusion.
Always been about you and
Poppy. What we are.
So, what does this all mean for the future of Poppy Playtime? If the prototype and Poppy are truly brother and sister, then Chapter 5 could be where this is explicitly revealed, perhaps through a tense conversation between the two. However, what if the prototype, as the older brother, uses this to manipulate Poppy? He could twist her perception, convincing her that nothing he did was truly wrong, slowly pulling her to his side and turning her against the player. And let's be honest, Poppy hasn't exactly been the most trustworthy ally up until this point, so the idea of her betraying us, it seems more than possible. What do you think about all this? Let me know your theories in the comments.